Should be about 3 hours. And we're going to start with Nate. One of the first things people kind of wanted to know about was matching cameras, especially different cameras. So Nate has a demo, and we'll get started with that. And if anyone has a question, digitally raise your hand in the participants panel. Just hover over your name and raise your hand, or message me privately and I can ask a question on your behalf. And after we do each section, we'll leave a little bit of time for questions and answers. Thanks, guys. All right, Nate, you're up.
Cool. So let me share my screen. For this one, I had an interview. This was something I was grading, like some promos for FX, and they shot one camera on Canon, which after a lot of trial and error, I found out was Rec. 709 color and Canon log gamma. And then the other camera was a FS7 shooting SG3. So with these two, I decided to use color space transform, OFX plugin, to put them actually both into ARRI. So what we had here, Rec. 709, input gamma.
I always have this error where I end up using Cine on film log instead of Canon log, just because I'm like shuffling through the list very quickly.
Right. Then ARRI Alexa and ARRI log C. So we go from a very Rec. 709-ish looking image to more log-ish image. And then this one, I did the same thing, but actually I'm just going to copy this from. This is going to be faster. So we can see here Sony S-Gamut Cine 3 and S-Log 3, and going to ARRI Alexa and ARRI log C. So there's still some white balance issues for sure, but at least they're, like, if you look on the waveform, a lot more similar. So then after doing that, then we could use these same LUTs. Let's just do. Actually, I believe for this one, I still use LCC because it was still too contrasty. Yeah, that's better. And then for this one, I use 709. So there was still some differences. Juan, can you speak to the fact of why that is? I mean,
yeah, I mean,
Rec. 709 image.
So yeah. So one thing is the color science, right? Like one thing is like what the color imagery is of the image, what the actual color gamut is. And then another thing that's still a factor even here, obviously, is the lensing, the sensor response, the lighting, then the exposure, right? Like how close was the aperture? And that can have a big impact on the perceived contrast, for example. So I think in the Canon case, they exposed lower than the Sony case. And so you have this kind of increased sort of contrast in the shadows, even though you've manipulated the log format from one format to another. So you still have this like kind of bumped up contrast. What I like to do in these cases, and Nate, if you want, I can kind of take the screen control and take the screen share and show another use case here.
Yeah.
But I like. Let me see if I can share my screen. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So this is a pilot project that we worked on a while back, and I have a bunch of different demos from this project, but I want to quickly show you one thing that happened. So in this case, everything was shot Sony f55. So everything's S-Log 3. It's pretty consistent. So I can actually I'm just going to use a timeline grade here and just throw on a Sony LUT. So we'll do the Sony Type A LUT. And so this gets me into a 709-ish space. And you can see actually that between these two shots, because there's an open window on the other side of this actor, we have really big lighting changes, right? One was shot while it was kind of overcast, a little bit darker. The other, the sun was kind of coming through, made the light much cooler and made it much brighter. And because this was shot with like an open window, they weren't writing it during a take. So it was just kind of like whatever the take happened during the take was happening on screen. So this is something that you guys probably see a lot of, and it's not that different from Nate from the example you kind of demoed, where you have, even though you can match the color science, you don't necessarily match the shot, right? And there's still some sort of lighting or exposure differences that are going to really affect the way the shot looks. So because I'm effectively here applying the LUT after the grade that I'm going to use log controls. So actually, if you go into the log controls here on which is the third page in the Resolve color controls, you can actually see you have this offset, by the way, is available on all the controls, but the offset is really the primary mechanism that I like to use for these grades. So right off the top, I can say, okay, well, this is clearly much brighter. I'm just going to move the window a little bit, and let me see if we can look at waveforms. Waveforms are tremendously useful for these kinds of things. So we can see this is much brighter. We can bring down the exposure, and I'm doing this all before the LUT. That's really important. If you do it after LUT, you need to do different controls. So I'm bringing down the exposure in order to kind of get it closer. I can actually grab a still. This is also really useful for matching shots. So I'm going to grab that still there and play the still from one to the other. So now I can see side by side how these two shots look. I can even use my reference sizing to sort of move the image over so I can really see their faces, right? So same actor, same face, same environment. Now I can really kind of start to match this up. So still a little too bright. Gonna bring it down some more. And that's getting closer. Let's see how that looks overall. Maybe a little dense in the, no, it's okay. Okay, so one thing we have here is there's a big difference between the background, which is lit by the practical lights, and the foreground, which is lit by the window. And so we're going to have to do something about that. Now, I'm going to try to do it really quickly. When we did the real thing, I did it in a much more finessed way where I went through it, kind of like cut out the actor and really did a much more detailed pass on this. I'm going to do this in kind of a quickie, easy way here. So I'm going to try and match the background as much as I can in my base grade. So I'm going to disregard the skins here and just look kind of like this at this background actor. So I'm looking at this area right here. And I think it can go a hair higher and a little bit cooler. So we're going to just kind of try to get it to match up a little too green there and there. So in the ballpark, I think that's a lot closer. We'll call that good enough for now. And then now we have a big issue. We have a giant difference in the skins and also in this blue sweater and all these other things. So now we can use secondaries. I can do a quick, key across the skin here and bring down the width so that I'm not getting any of the extra stuff. And I can actually use high con. I'm going to turn off my reference mode. Hang on a second. I can actually use my high con display of my mask in order to see, or my matte in order to see what my key looks like. And I'm just going to kind of see if I can tease out this stuff a little bit more. Maybe I can't quite do it. There we go. All right, so now we're getting a lot of that skin. And I'm just going to see if I can do it here, here. One thing I'm not getting is this guy, right? So I want to make sure I'm not tweaking that guy. I'm tweaking everything else. So with that done, I'm just going to soften up that selection quite a bit. And then I can go away from purple and towards, actually, let's go towards warmth here. And now we can play the still again, and I can look at how it looks, and I can try and match it up a little bit more. And we're getting in the ballpark. So that was this is a very quick version. I'm going to turn off the reference mode, but you can see already that shot looking much, much closer. You still need to tweak the sweater, you need to pick out these individual things. That is a worst case scenario or near worst case scenario of shot matching, because here you have identical setups, identical scenes. You have drastically different lighting, drastically different exposure, and a mismatch in color temperature, a mismatch in exposure, right? So that is about the worst case, where you're actually having to go through and pick out individual elements and actually tweak those. Generally, like in a situation like, for example, Nate, what you demoed, where you have the same setup, it's controlled lighting, it's controlled exposure, it's a much easier adjustment. Then you're just using one node, you're just using those offset controls, and you're just getting that color balance to match, and you're getting that exposure to match.
Sweet. Hey, Juan, we had a question about reference sizing. Would you mind just showing that again and how you can use it in other ways to to
Sure. So
be useful?
anytime you're in, this is by the way, really weird reference there. Anytime you're in a kind of a timeline, either with the timeline reference with a reference movie, I remember we'll get into that a little bit later, or you're using a still reference, you can pull it up, display it on the screen, and then you're actually able to go into, there's 5 different sizing scenarios here. We can kind of talk about these later maybe. Edit sizing, which is what happens in the edit page. Input sizing, which is kind of like very first thing that gets processed, is how the image gets scaled. So if you have an anamorphic image, for example, you can set the input sizing to de-anamorphic that image. You have output sizing, which is the thing that happens after everything else gets processed. Then you have node sizing, which I don't know if we'll have time to get into it, but it's basically processes that can happen on a per node basis, although they are lossy because they happen at the timeline resolution. And then reference sizing. Reference sizing just applies to the image that gets displayed when you turn on show reference wipe. The reference mode can be showing another timeline. It can be showing an offline reference movie. In this case, it's showing the gallery still. And then with this, I'm able to use any of the sort of sizing controls, position controls. You don't get pitch, you don't get yaw, which you don't need anyways. You don't get blanking, which you don't need anyways. But you can tilt, you can zoom. So I could like zoom this up to match the sort of reference here. And I can start to see, you know, that skin needs to be a little bit denser. This exposure needs to be down on the skin, for example. Let me see if I can do that real quick. So I'm just going to bring down the highlight control there so I get a little more density in the skins. You know, you can see these kinds of details by sort of reframing shots, which is handy. It's great for matching like a close-up to a wide and vice versa. You can also rotate if you need to rotate that. So you have those controls available. And you can also stretch the sizing either uniformly through zoom or independently for X and Y values through height and width. Questions about that?
That was awesome. I have to admit, I didn't know what the reference sizing was for.
I usually, well, one thing that gets tricky is sometimes I'll forget I've adjusted the reference sizing. And so then I'll try and like match one shot that's the same framing to another shot that's the same framing. And all of a sudden it's like skewed off. What I have gotten into the habit of doing is resetting it when I'm done with it. So I just quickly reset it. And then when I move on to the next shot, the sizing is consistent.
Exactly. Awesome. Does anyone have any questions about what we just went over? If not, we'll move on to matching skin tones. Jamie. Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, it's Ben. Yeah, Juan, thank you. So I think you might have just mentioned it. Does it get saved with each gallery still, your different reference sizing for each still, or is that a global?
It's a global. It affects, not only does it affect the stills, but it'll also affect the position of the offline reference. It'll affect the position of, if you do multiple timelines, you're comparing timelines using the reference mode, it'll affect the positioning of that. So it's global and it's also persistent.
And could you go over how to pull in a video as a reference? I never knew you could do that in this same place.
Well, we're going to go over conform later, and that's when you bring in a reference video for conform.
Yeah, the one thing to point out is that the reference video is more for timing and edits than it is for like referencing what the look should be or what the image should be. So it's not like, it doesn't function the same way as it would in the still gallery. Where in the still gallery, you can put any frame to any other frame. So you can compare, I can take a frame from over here, grab a still and compare it to a frame from over here, and I can play the still and compare it. So that's totally independent. Where the reference, the offline reference movie is locked to your timeline.
Got it. Hey, Dave Satin has a question. Dave, go ahead.
Hey, Dave.
Hey, Juan, how you doing?
Good.
You dropped the LUT on the whole timeline. I either my headset dropped out or there was some bird flew by, but I missed that completely.
Yes, I just because my whole timeline here is Rec 79. I also wanted to quickly apply it to both shots without having to. I also was going to do all my manipulation underneath the LUT. So in this case, I applied it to the timeline grade instead of the clip grade. I dig your background, by the way, Dave.
Oh, thanks. It was the how, I think, is the how. I missed the how.
Oh, you see this little nub right here? So there's like two little nubs. Let me move there's also this pull down. Maybe the windows are over it. I don't know. No,
we can see it. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So there's clip
sets of grades. So you can have, one thing you don't want to do is have very time dependent grades in the timeline. So you don't want to have things like keyframes or tracking in the timeline grade, but you can have a whole other set of grades that happen to every clip in the timeline in this timeline page. So you're able to switch between clip and timeline. Clip
So
only
I'm
applies to.
I'm gonna wonder what I'm gonna do with the extra 10 hours a week you just saved me.
So the clip, one thing to point out is the clip grades only apply to that individual clip. The timeline grades apply to every shot in the timeline. So every shot in the timeline now has this 709 LUT on it, you see? Now,
Right, so if you're working in the same color space, you have one LUT to apply to every clip. That's a way to do it on the basis of the whole timeline in one shot.
Correct. So if you're working on a show, for example, with a show LUT, you just throw that show LUT into the timeline node tree. And then on the individual clips, you might be making adjustments for white balance or exposure or whatever. And also, if you want to throw a window or whatever the DP asks you to do, you can do that on the individual clips. But just keep in mind that those modifications are happening in log space. So the regular primary controls, these sorts of lift gamma gain controls, don't work the same way mathematically in that log space than they do in the video space.
Copy. Great info. Hey,
I'm sorry, Jimmy. One last quick follow-up. So, okay, so normally what I would do is I would have 3 nodes, right? I'd have a sizing node and and the aces, and I'm sorry, and my CDL node followed by a node that has the 3D LUT. That would make that would make the grading on the middle node work differently than if I just applied the LUT to the whole timeline? Is that what
it would work the same. If your order of operations is CDL modifications and then LUT, which it sounds like it is,
yes,
then that order of operations will still be consistent if you put that LUT in the timeline node instead of the clip node.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Yeah, just to go back a little bit before we move on, there's a question about just going over the qualifier that you used. Could you just show that process a little, like, one more time, and just how you made the selection?
Why don't we jump on skins, and then I can talk about it when we talk about skins, because that's kind of more relevant there. Okay. I don't know if you want to start with, if Nate wants to start with skins.
Yeah, and we'll go to Nate, but then Nate, everyone just wanted to see a quick little rundown of that that plugin that you use, the color transform thing.
Yeah.
So Nate's going to switch over to his screen.
Oh, let me stop share.
Yeah, so let's go back here to the ungraded. So let's see, back here we have the 2 with the color space transform. So yeah, you just select your inputs and your outputs color spaces and gammas. So then on top of that, I was going to show one the other way that I work sometimes. It doesn't have as much repo room as the reference sizing, but using the viewer here and going to selected clips, now you can see the 2 there, and if you wanted to then you could say do the main look on here.
So you're looking at 2 different cameras right there, right, Nate?
So yeah, there's the 2 different cameras, and they're pulled up with the split screen viewer. So you can you could select all the clips on your timeline, show them all here. So for these 2, just doing this, but what I like is that you could then click back and forth. So like, rather than if you're like the reference that I'm trying to match to, I actually kind of want to change that. Then you could, quickly pop back and forth. And then say, go back to this shot that's over here.
And so are you using this plugin on like commercial work just to help match all the various cameras that we might have?
Yeah, because a lot of times like we'll be all Alexa show, and then we'll have the drone guys come in with a red. It's not so much of an issue now with like Log3G10. Like is pretty easy to do. But before, when it was like red gamma 4 or you know, or whatever, it'd be easier to just use the color space transform to put it into array log space, and then just use the same LUT that I'm using for the rest of the cameras for the commercial. Yeah.
Nate, I would just just to point out to people that the when you do this multi-view, it's not necessarily color accurate in a critical sense. So it's good for like referencing relative differences. But if you are making absolute judgments about your image, some things get really funky in this sort of scaled down view versus the full screen view.
Correct. So yeah, so the other thing is like, yeah, if because it's resolution dependent. So like if you have a grain effect plugged on here, like you'll see that the grain gets super funky when you put up multiple clips like this.
So you'd want to just disable the grain when you go into that view, just to make it cleaner.
I would say, sorry, Nate, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, like, if you were then wanting to get more accurate about it, then yeah, switch over to wiping with a still.
Yeah, I would say like you're good to make that kind of relative evaluation. So if you're looking at the sort of split screen, you can say, oh, this shot is darker or brighter or warmer or cooler than this other shot. And you can do that even if you have grain applied, it just looks kind of chunky. But like even I find that even grades don't look exactly the same when in that mode. So often like the blacks will get a little bit crushed in that view, where they won't be in the more detailed view. I think it's maybe because of the scaling, like it just has less information, less detail in those shadows. So I try to just basically reference kind of overall tonality and then go into the individual view to actually evaluate sort of more stylistic decisions about the image.
Sure. Hey, Nate, can you scrub independently when you're in the multi-view?
No, they're
Like
they're locked together. So you play, but it works all right. So if you're like an interview, for instance,
right.
This one is not from the same moment, but they'll play. They're locked together.
Yeah, it's cool because you can actually like watch it down, and you can also have it do like split screen of versions, so you can look at different versions. If you have like one take or one idea for the shot or another idea for the shot, you want to show that, Nate? How you can switch?
So if I make a couple different versions, let's make this one super green, make this one super pink, and we'll make this one black and white. So then you can use the viewer here and go versions and can quickly kind of match them up and give your DP options of what to see.
I would, and when you're showing them that, I would make sure you caveat that the grain, for example, or the scaling isn't exactly right. So it might be a little less more contrasted than it would be in the actual full screen version. But this is great to sort of go like that kind of gut instinct feeling. You're like, oh, it's number 3 is the one I like.
Yeah. We'll get to this later, but one of the things people want to talk about was versioning and like getting a DP to kind of settle on a look. And what Nate has up right now is what we were going to cover later. It's awesome to at least get them to hone in on what they're trying to get. Sometimes you just need to see a bunch of images and pick the best one.
Now in this multi-view, does whichever little square you have selected, does that go to your SDI out full quality?
No, so it'll be your whole viewer will see that.
Got it.
It just basically mirrors this whole thing. And then if you want to see full screen, then just exit out of there, and then you can just toggle through your.
If I'm not mistaken, you can do that while it's playing. So you can actually while you're playing back, if you play back that shot.
Yeah, then it'll show you all.
You can actually toggle it on and off as you're playing it.
Awesome.
Or not. Maybe that's just on the panels.
There
it is. Yeah, it's a delay. So, I mean, I think in this case, you've got 5 grades on this shot. It's probably really taxing on your machine, but like on set, if you have like the mini panel, you can actually toggle on the mini panel.
Nice. Hey, there was a quick question about the color space transform tool. If it's the same 709 D-Log LUT that we're seeing out of the camera, or can you choose like the different D-Logs from Arri?
Oh, so for that, I was putting the D-Log as a separate LUT. So this is only changing from one log space to another log space. If you to go Rec 709. That I actually am not.
If you want, I can get into that, Nate.
Yeah. Here, let me share yours.
Yeah, let's spend a few minutes going over this since people seem interested in it.
Okay, I'm gonna basically kind of go through the very lightweight version of this because it's a really dense topic. As I'm sure you guys know, color science and color management is kind of really complicated. So you know, the color space transform node is really powerful in that it lets you, like Nate showed, quickly change the color space of one camera into another camera. It works really, really well. One thing that gets a little bit tricky is, so one of the advantages of being able to, for example, apply the ARRI LUT is that some of the ARRI look is actually in the LUT, not in the camera. Things like that kind of roll off on the highlights and the desaturate in the highlights and certain sort of tonality things in the midtones, they're actually part of the LUT. So when you're, for example, shooting Red or Sony or Canon, and you want to kind of get that sort of ARRI look, if you're matching it, particularly matching it to a ARRI camera, you can really easily do what Nate showed and transform the log space of one camera into another. And then by using the ARRI LUT, you're able to sort of simulate those things. One thing that you're also able to do with this color space transform is actually kind of do your own transforms, right? So I'm just going to pull up the color space transform here. So if I apply this color space transform to this, in this case, Sony S-Log3 shot. So I'm going to say the incoming here is Sony, I think it's S-Gamma 3 and S-Log3. You'll get something like a Rec 709 look. Now, this is different. I'm just going to add a new version here, and I'm going to reset this, and I'm going to add that LUT, the Sony standard LUT. These things are different, right? So if we go back and forth between these two, oh, how come version 1 isn't? Oh, I didn't create a new version, that's why. Undo. Control Y, there it is. And I'm going to add the LUT. Sony type 1, and now I can go back. No, I didn't do it. Undo. Hang on a second, guys, sorry.
All good.
S-Gamut, S-Log3. I'm trying to be fancy and use the keyboard shortcuts, but. All right, so I got version 1, version 2. Reset this node. I'm gonna throw on the 3D LUT, Sony 3D LUT, type A, whoops. Sony 3D LUT. Oh man, this is not cooperating today. There we go. Type A. And version 1 is loaded. Version 2, load. Okay, great. So version 1 here is, oh, that's why they added versioning to the clip. Okay, Dave, watch out for that. Sometimes you get confused, you get really excited, and you end up applying the grade in the timeline instead of applying it to the clip when you mean to apply it to the clip. So S-Gamut 3 Cine, S-Log3, great. And then for my next trick, I'm going to load version 2. So I'm going to add a new version, create a new version, call it version 2. And in this one, I'm going to reset this, and now I'm going to apply that LUT. 3D LUT, Sony, whoops, 3D LUT, Sony, type A. Back, forth. Okay, great. So this is my color space transform. This is my LUT transform, right? So in the LUT transform, you have a few things going on. You have a little bit of that ARRI style knee, which Sony added in the type A LUT. The type A LUT is type Alexa LUT. And it basically does a similar thing to what the Alexa LUT, the ARRI Alexa LUT does, which is it rolls off the highlights, it rolls off the saturation and the shadows and the highlights, and it does a little bit of like mid-tone-y kind of stuff. So you can see there's a big difference between those things. But there's another thing that's happening that's in the Sony LUT that is not. So the visible, the information space of that S-Log3 material is a lot wider. It represents a vastly higher number of nits than your Rec 709 monitor, right? Your Rec 709 is supposed to be 120 nits or 100 nits. The values represented in that Sony, S-Log footage is, I think, 16 stops of information, although the camera doesn't really do 16 stops. But the log format has 16 stops of information, so significantly higher dynamic range than your video display is able to produce. So how do you adapt a much wider, much higher nit value display into a much narrower, a much wider nit value source format into a much narrower nit value display? That's tone mapping. That's the process of like mapping those tones. So we map the range of highlights and high luminance information into what the display can do. It's not mathematically accurate because it's an abstracted representation. It is a scaled representation of those luminance values. Everybody with me? Show of hands. Okay, James, good. Yeah. Okay, so that is where tone mapping kicks in. So that's the thing that those LUTs have built into them that we have to do manually in the color space transform. And there's a whole category for this. So that we have tone mapping, and I would suggest using the simple tone mapping as a starting point. And what you can see there, everybody see what that did? It immediately takes those highlights and scales them down to something reasonable for that Rec 709 monitor. So now the difference between the version 1 and version 2 here, the LUT and the CST, is a lot smaller in terms of that luminance. It is significantly more saturated, right? Because those color values in the Sony S-Gamma 3 Cine color values are a lot wider than the Rec 709 can display. So we can do a little bit of saturation mapping, and that'll kind of scale down those saturation values. And so now you have this much, much closer transform. Everybody seeing that? Right? Mm-hmm. You have a much closer representation of it. Now, the thing that it's missing is the kind of special saucy saturation and skin stuff that the Type A LUT or the ARRI LUT do, right? It's missing that kind of like almost cinematic film mask kind of saturation roll-off. And you can kind of build those things up in a grade if you want. But that's something to keep in mind when you're using that color space transform tool, is that it's very mathematical, right? It is very much built on scene referred values. How bright is this log format supposed to be? How many nits does it represent? And then it adapts one format to another. If you have a camera that doesn't have that much of a dynamic range, it's going to clip in a really ugly way, where a camera with a higher dynamic range won't inside of this CST. Color space transform node we call CST, just so you know.
Awesome.
I also didn't have an example, but it also falls apart a lot with low bitrate footage, compressed, A7S, even though it's log, the bits aren't there to really make it work so well.
Yeah, so one thing that happens is that the log formats that the manufacturers define are really tuned to their compression and really tuned to their camera, right? So they kind of allocate those bit values along that log curve. They're not all identical, right? Cineon is different from ARRI log C, and it's different from Sony S log, and it's different from Canon log. All of these manufacturers have these kind of uniquely adapted curves that are tuned to their image. So when you take a low performance camera or a low performance codec, like you would have on a Sony FS7, or even like the Canon cameras don't hold up particularly well. The C100, C300 do not hold up particularly well. Or C200, when you manipulate those log formats into another log format that represents a camera with higher definition, or a codec with higher definition, like for example in ARRI log C, you'll start to see breaking in the image that you wouldn't see in the manufacturer's native log, because that different log is stretching the image in a way that the manufacturer of the other camera wasn't anticipating. Make sense?
Yeah. Nate, did you want to show us a quick thing on the CST where you're matching two things real quick, and then we'll move on? You had a good example of it we were looking over.
Let's see, what were we talking about here? Which one, Jamie? I'm sorry.
I know Steve Harnell wanted me to ask you about it.
Steve.
Oh, I think it was just described. But
okay, great.
There we go.
Nate, do you want to talk about skin tones?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, sure. So I'm just gonna reset this. I don't know. For myself, if it's a standalone shot, it's more about just grading for the skin tone than the scene overall. But sometimes it's the reverse, where you have to have the scene be matching and the skin tone is the thing that's sticking out. So yeah, for this, I always like to use the vector scope. Move some windows here. And yeah, I use that show 2x zoom, and I always like to use that skin tone indicator, and that's always kind of been, I don't know, what about you, Juan? That's kind of always my guiding light, is to hit it on that line. All the stuff that I had, though, everybody's skin tone was pretty good, but what I use a lot is hue versus hue and hue versus sat. So you can take the eyedropper. Let me do a different. So you can see here just like where his skin tone. So his skin tone's kind of a bit more red than it should.
And you're using this to show you exactly where his skin tone's falling,
yeah, this is
right?
just for me to narrow the vector scope, just to kind of get a better eye on it.
So it blocks out everything else except for skin tone.
Yeah, exactly. I'll reset that and then do it with click on it with the curve, and then you can see the skin tone on the vector scope and on the display kind of. And I'm kind of getting more towards that line there.
So one thing that's great about this hue versus hue is that you can actually take outlier values. So if you have like a mixed complexion or maybe mixed lighting in a scene, you can actually tease the outlier values and kind of compress them into that one hue. So it's a great tool for that. I don't know if I use it so much for like honing in the skin value so much as like correcting outside the skin value.
Yeah, it works great for like super pink cheeks and noses, or blotchy skin.
Rowdy faces, or like weird mixed lighting, like you have side of face is kind of lit by one color temperature and the other side is another. Or like it'll even do a lot to like correct for like blemishes that you might have a little bit of luminance difference, but it really takes away, for example, like the kind of reddy pink pimples, that kind of stuff, can get corrected quite a bit with the hue curves.
Yeah.
You do that by kind of making like a little like bucket in the hue curve.
I mean, Nate, when you're finished, I can show a version of that on my end if you want.
Yeah. I was going to show one more thing was if you added a layer node, and this is, don't always do this, but sometimes it helps a lot. I use a color generator from time to time. And I'll actually find like that skin tone that I like. I just need some feathering and change mixing modes to sometimes hue or color. So let's go color because that's pretty crazy. And then changing like the output of how much gain you want on it. And that times I've used that sometimes, like if you're trying to get like a specific, darker, or if you want to go full Trump,
Don't go full Trump, bro.
Yeah, let's not do that. But yeah, that's something that I use quite a bit. And then, even if you're not using the color generator, that would be my go-to for just isolating skin tone, is keying, do some blurs.
So it's a great way the way you're doing it, it's a great way to see if there's like green in the skin tone. Like if you're using a filter that has too much green in it, you can see it on the vector scope clean, and then you can start coloring the image, to get it in the right direction.
Right. So yeah, I just keyed, and then I'm just using the mid-tone trackball for right now. Juan, I'll let you show demo on here.
Cool.
Joe Bellick had a question real quick before we move on. Joe, just make sure you unmute yourself.
Hey guys. I had just a question about the node order in what you were just doing, and just in terms of, I guess, how well something performs in the node tree when you have like your D log in the front versus the output of your node tree. And, you know, I've heard so many different things about different performance, and I understand mathematically what's going on in it, but I was looking for like real world examples of like, do you guys run into situations where you definitely want that D log at the end versus throwing it in the beginning and then doing these fine hue versus hue curves, you know, when it can really make a difference, I guess.
What do you,
Hey,
what do you
Joe,
mean
just-
by, sorry.
Sorry,
what
real
do-
quick. That's actually our next topic. So we're going to go over that.
Oh,
Great. Joe, just for my reference while we have you on, what do you mean by performance is different?
well, like if you were to throw a D log on as, I think it was Nathan who did that first. He threw a D log on first on that Sony footage. And then after the image was D logged, he then went on to do a couple secondary curves and stuff like that. So basically, you know, there's a difference in math happening versus if he were to do that on the, if he were to take the log as the input, take a node, run a secondary hue versus hue on that, and then output the lot after
So
that.
just to clarify, so by performance, you mean like behavior, like the way it behaves?
Yes, sorry.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just the behavior.
Okay, we'll come back to that and we'll cover that.
Cool.
To get back to the sort of more topic at hand here. So skin tones are a little like there is a school of thought, and that is kind of pretty effective, pretty easy, of using that skin line. So if you use that the skin tone line was actually like it wasn't actually originally the skin tone line. It was like the, I forget what the IV axis or whatever. It was a different color axis. And so this was the axis of like warmth. And so it just happened that like it lined up pretty well with skin, and skin was a good reference. And so we ended up in terms of the way the vector scope is organized with this sort of line indicator for what skin should be. There's a couple of schools of thought on it. One is that if you look at studies, and there have been like a ton of photographic studies of like skin tones, under similar lighting, under similar photographic conditions, like skin tones tend to kind of cluster like pretty tightly along that line. So if you can see my mouse, you can probably see the line right there. And so generally you'll see skin tones. I'm just going to try and use the offset to sort of move it around. So you can generally see skin tones sort of falling, you know, kind of within, I would say within the range of sort of what you're seeing now, right? So that kind of narrow range of values like that, it sort of extends to an area around that eye line. And so as a shorthand, it's like a good way to sort of say, okay, skin should be here. But I would caution that you shouldn't take it too literally. Like skins don't have to be exactly on that line. They just need to sort of, you know, compress around that line. It's a suggestion, not an absolute rule, right? So if you find that as you're working through a shot, you're by putting the skins onto that line, they look unnatural, it looks weird, you should err on the side of not looking weird, right? Don't take it too literally. So that's one thing about the skin tones. Another is that, so where you end up is a little bit subjective. I feel like it has a lot to do with what the shot composition is. Like if the lighting in the shot is very warm or very cool, the skin's going to be a little bit different. If you're trying to communicate something different about the scene, you might want to go with like less saturated and more bluish skin. If it's a horror movie or a dark scene, you might want to go a little bit warmer, brighter for like a romantic comedy, right? It's a little subjective. So there's a lot of wiggle room. So I'm not going to beat you too hard on like where skin should be. There's a couple of things that I do regularly. One, I'm going to show you that I don't do that I see people doing, because effectively I'm going to show you a couple other ways to sort of do a similar thing. So you can, by the way, Joe, I'm keying after the node, but it doesn't after the LUT, but it doesn't really matter. I'm just doing this just to be able to show you in an easier way what I'm doing. So here I'm taking. Trying to do a pretty good selection on the skins. It's not too crazy. I'm going to take out the low sat stuff, do something like that. And I'm going to blur it out a little bit more. All right, so I have something like a skin qualification there. And one thing I see people doing, or I've seen people do that I don't necessarily recommend, is actually kind of like desatting these values and then using the grade to kind of warm it back up. And what this does is it forces all of the values in that range to sort of coalesce around the value you intend. So you're basically like taking away the original color and then replacing it with this new color that you intend, right? So that's one thing I've seen people do. I don't think it's the best way to get here. I think there's other ways to do it. One that Nate sort of touched on is the idea of like using the qualifiers to sort of you do hue versus hue, right? So you can do this with or without a qualification. I'm just going to add another node before this. And so here I'm selecting this node. And so now without a qualification, I can say, okay, I really like the hue of his skin. And by the way, this is David Hugh, we call him Hugh. So the hue of his skin kind of in this area. I like where this skin is. And you can see I've clicked on there and it's created a point in the hue versus hue curve. And so now I know where that point is. And you can see that there's a lot of values sort of coalescing around that point, but not quite exactly on that point. So I can take the other points and I can create another reference point. So I'm going to say, I don't want to touch any values beyond this hue. And I don't want to touch any values beyond this hue. So between this hue and this hue, I'm going to manipulate it with these controls. So now I can take this color and say, make it compress around that target color. I can tweak that target color a little bit if I want. I'm not going to do that too much. Let me see if I can kind of improve my mouse a little bit. And I can tweak this color and make it coalesce around that. So you can see I did those two little manipulations. I tweaked colors that were on the greenish side of the red that I wanted and made them more red. And I tweaked the colors that were on the purplish side of the red that I wanted and I made them more red. Make sense? And so the net of that is I get like much more compressed hues with fewer outliers, right? So the color tone here, you know, I have a little green right here, a little bit of a green hue. That's gone away. It's a little too purpley right now, but I'm going to tweak that with a little bit of this and a little of that. And now I've exaggerated that even more just to show you. I'm going to actually move this guy over here and move this here and move this.
So this is in essence making his skin tone more uniform.
Correct. It's taking the outlier hue values and compressing them. Now, this is an exaggerated version of what you would do, but you can also, and Nate, you showed this a little bit, you can also take the key output and like reduce that effect a little bit if you wanted to. So you can kind of, you know, fine tune that. Now, that's a good practical use case for where you have like the kind of scenarios where we talked about, where you have somebody maybe with some uneven skin complexion. I'm going to see if I have anything like that in my film here. I don't think I do. Oh, well, this might be a good shot here. So, oh yeah, this is kind of what I did here, right? Like when I tweaked this color and kind of compressed that down to make it match a little bit more. So another thing I actually like to do is actually use another one of the OFX plugins called Color Compressor, and I'm going to show you that right now. So, cool. I have in this case part of the performance is he's supposed to have kind of this red eye. He's been slapped. I'm trying to find a good frame here where we can actually see it pretty well. All right, so there were a couple problems here. The red wasn't kind of like ruddy enough. It needed to be a little more pronounced. And so in this case, I actually had to do kind of two things. So one, I used the layer node. I keyed out the red so that I could select the really saturated, more ruddy notes here. And I just wanted the higher saturation stuff. And I wanted to narrow the width a little bit. So I just have that. And I wanted it kind of rough. And I had to use a window to sort of narrow that down. I'm just going to show you on this one frame because I don't want to have to show you tracking right now. So cool. What I've done here is with a layer node, I've now bypassed. So whatever I'm going to do on this node is not going to affect these pixels, right? So the layer node is kind of like, it's kind of like a layer stack in After Effects, except it works top to bottom. So the node on the bottom is being displayed over the pixels above it. With me? So now I can go through here and I can do my skin selection. I can maybe select the skins pretty broadly. I'm going to just narrow down the width of the hue a little bit. You can see that I use the sort of the tools here and the keyer quite a bit. And I don't care if I get those red cheeky pixels because I'm going to deal with those separately. They're being affected afterwards. But I want to make sure that I don't get a lot of the hair or a lot of other pixels. So I'm going to just kind of tweak that a little bit. And let's call that good enough for now. No, not good enough. I'm just going to add that. And that's better. Okay. So now I can use the color compressor on the skins outside of this ruddy area. And the way the color compressor works is it lets you manipulate the color in HSL space. So I can set a target hue, a target saturation, target luminance by just picking a color that I want. So I'm just going to go through here and I'm just going to eyedrop this color here, let's say. And I'm going to say that's the color I want. I maybe don't want it that dark. I'm going to tweak the color a little bit. Maybe I want a little more pinky. Maybe I want a little less saturation. Let's do, yeah, that looks skin tony, right? Let's say that. So now when I tweak this hue value, what's going to happen is, I'm going to show you the luminance and the saturation first. What's going to happen is it's going to take all the pixels and compress them down into this one color. So if I make the luminance all that color, you can see it just goes flat. It just becomes one color value, right? And you can dial this in as much or as little as you want. I usually don't touch the luminance. Saturation, it just makes everything as saturated as the reference color, right? And you can dial this in as much or as little as you want. And then the hue just takes everything and compresses it down to that one color. So between these two, that's a little too orangey. Let me see if I can just make it a little pinkier. And by the way, you can tweak it on the fly and you can see it'll actually like change it as you tweak it. So you can dial in exactly what you want that color to be. In this case, I'm gonna say a little less saturation and maybe, that's good. Okay, so I've dialed in that color before, after, you can see that changes the saturation quite a bit. And now I can even do that on this ruddy stuff. So if I want to add a color compressor here, I can say, okay, I want everything to be like really bright red. And I'm just going to take this and tweak it a little bit. So I'm going to take that and go like over here. And that's going to be my reference color. And now I can take the hue and make them all that hue, and the saturation, make them all that saturation. Luminance, I can make them all that luminance. And now I can really kind of exaggerate those features. So that's the color compressor tool.
Nice.
And this is kind of a exaggerated example, but like it works really, really well at like honing in skins. One thing that is nice is using this, you can use timeline grades or group grades and kind of like match skins throughout a scene, which is really handy because you know, that tends to be pretty consistent. And so you can use a really kind of broad brush on skins with those tools.
Awesome. Any questions about this before we move on? We're going to move on to order of operations right now. Joe, to your question, this will be great to show the examples of what falls apart and why. And Nate, you're up. I think you're going to share your screen, right?
Sure. So I'll use this clip. I mean, so you can see just, say if I did a hue versus hue, and you can see this on the waveform too. Say if I try to get those blues here and shift them over. If I did that before, I'm just hitting E to take that out and put it before, it reacts differently. So if I make another one. I've got too many versions now. Sorry. Gosh, let me delete these all.
Are you going to show us how the highlights look different?
Yeah, I can show you that one too. Well, what I was basically trying to show is just how the hues react differently if you do the hue versus hue before or after the LUT. And it's not necessarily like either one's better. I think it's if you do it after the LUT, your hue selection is going to be a little bit more specific than if you're before. It's a little bit more gradual when it's working on log. And this is on like just an uncolor managed timeline. So for, I don't know, for big moves overall, like, I mean, sometimes I'll go before the LUT and say like saturate and darken reds will usually work better for me if I do it before the LUT rather than after. And then other order of operations things is, you know, say we have this LUT here, for just clipping out the highlights. If you try to bring the highlights down, you don't get that information back. But if you were to use that same thing before the LUT, then you do have it, because the LUT is a destructive thing that'll clip and clip downstream unless you put a node before it or reference before it. Juan?
You kind of just have to keep an eye on these things to know when it's destructive, and like, is there a rule, or you kind of just have to have an eye for it when you're working destructively like this?
So the LUTs would be destructive anything downstream on the nodes. If it's clipped on the LUT, then it'll stay clipped unless you point back before it. Was there any more, Juan, on color manage timeline? I'm trying to remember which one of these tools are destructive. I thought it was just LUT.
No. So it's there's a whole mix. It's not just color managed timeline. So there's certain tools that most of the tools are 32-bit float and will carry through information all the way through the chain. What can clip is the timelines don't pass. LUTs don't pass through 32-bit information, so they don't pass through float information. So anything above and beyond the values you're actually displaying, you don't preserve. Also, I haven't tested in a while, but the hue versus curves used to clip the same way. So they would actually destroy information beyond a certain amount. What else? I think the OFX plugins are kind of dependent. Not all of them are float. So some will pass through information, some will not. Things like the color palette, for example, doesn't pass through information. Oh, good. Jamie, you're sharing that order of operations. That's a slightly different data set, but it's a really good one. If you guys can see the order of operations image that Jamie just put up. This is more like the order of operations inside of the inside of Resolve. So this is how things are sort of rendered out. This order of operations that take place within a node, this is also sequential. So this is within each node, these operations take place in this order, but that also happens in the next node over. And obviously the node order is in the order of operations. So the first node is first, second node is second. So it processes all of these effects within that node in that order. But the operations that take place before nodes happen in sort of the media management side of things. So that includes like the input LUTs, which I don't think you should ever use an input LUT. There's really no reason to use one. But the camera adjustments, the IDTs or color space transform stuff that you do, not in the node tree, but in color management, which we're not really touching today, but is a pretty dense topic. Edit sizing and input sizing, all that stuff happens before the nodes get affected. And then all the stuff within the nodes get affected in that order. And you can see, for example, things like the 3D or 1D LUTs are applied sort of towards the end of that processing. The node sizing inside of the node is something that is very lossy because it's applied within the node, as opposed to like the input sizing, which is applied on input, or the output sizing, which is applied after everything else is done. And then you can see output sizing, output LUTs, color space management. Usually it's one or the other. Like if you're not going to use an output LUT if you're using color space management, for example, or ASIS. And then the output page or the display LUT if that's being displayed on screen. I was actually just struggling to bring up that graphic, Jamie, so that's great.
It's in the Resolve manual if anybody's looking for it as well.
Yeah, and I think Alexis Van Herkman did a post on it that's actually, if
Yeah.
you Google Resolve Order of Operations, you'll find it.
If you're running into issues, just reference this chart. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Juan, but I think a lot of post houses or colorists build like a node structure that honors this so that they always have it, as they work. So they're not trying to reorder nodes on the fly and keep.
This is slightly different, right? So this order of operations is per node. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's the order of operations that you're going to do inside of your grade.
Right.
If you want to, I'm just going to take over the screen again. I can kind of sort of talk about that a little more. Do you want to release the screen?
Yep.
Sweet. So back over here. Yeah, I think what Nate touched on was pretty good in that there's certain things that are destructive inside of a LUT. Joe, you were talking about like operations. There's some things that So mathematically, there's things that you want to do before a LUT. They work better. The math works better before a LUT. I work in a really kind of methodical, sort of more scientific approach for the most part before the creative stuff. So in terms of shot matching, shot balancing, I try to do all that stuff before a LUT using controls that are appropriate for a log image. So that means offset. That means I use contrast and pivot to a lot. Those things all happen before a LUT and should be used before a LUT. Let me show you what that means a little bit. Let me see if I can, I'm just gonna quickly see if I can generate, let's do a grayscale. Yes. Yes, perfect. Okay, so, and I'm just gonna select this grayscale. I'm gonna create a new compound. By the way, I don't know if you guys know this. So if you have a grayscale in the timeline or any kind of these generators in the timeline, and you go into the color page, you can end up on that frame, but you can't access it from the color page. You see, you don't have the thumbnail there. You can't access or grade that shot. But if you make it a compound clip, so you right click and say, make new compound clip, doesn't matter what the name is, and you go into there, you'll now have access to that clip. So, that's one thing that's really useful. So here you can see, I'm just going to reset the sizing so we can all see, and I'm going to use I'm going to switch to, if I can remember how to do it, I'm going to switch to the waveform. All right, so everybody see that straight line, right? Really easy to understand straight line. Okay, so things like offset, for example, really kind of move the whole range of values up and down in this very uniform way. Everybody seeing that, right? I use offset, it moves the whole range up and down in a very straightforward way. Where gain, you know, doesn't do that, right? Gain, midtones, and lifts. You guys, I'm sure, are experts at this. You deal with CDLs, you know exactly what this is.
It's awesome that you're showing it this way, though. I was hoping you would.
Okay, so when you have a LUT on, let's say I have a really, you know, normal LUT like the Arri log C LUT. You can see that what it's doing is increasing contrast in that curve, right? So that curve went from being a straight line to now an S curve. Everybody seeing that, right? So now, if I do operations before this node, I just added a node before the node, and I do that offset, you can see that it really kind of respects that curve in a really elegant way, right? Like it moves that exposure up and down the curve really elegantly, almost like kind of a gain control after the LUT. So then if I add it after the LUT and I do that same offset, you can see that it does it in a really ugly way that does not respect that curve. You seeing that? So
yeah.
On the flip side, the gain works really nicely, similarly to how the offset, right? Gamma, gain, these controls work really nicely and elegant post-LUT. They work kind of sloppily before the LUT. So I'm just gonna reset this. So now if I do the gain, you can see how it kind of like tweaks the curve in a really weird way, right? Same thing with the lift, like it just gets chunky and weird, right? So these controls, the lift, gamma, gain controls are not the best controls before a LUT. The offset controls are not the best controls after a LUT, and the pivot and contrast will work okay in both, but they work spectacularly well before the LUT, and they work kind of clunkily after the LUT to some degree, right? So they'll work, but not as nicely as it works before the LUT. So that drives a lot of the decisions about the order of operations that I do as a colorist. Now, and just to show you here, that color space transform doesn't change this fact, because this isn't about float or cutting off or losing information, right? This is the LUT will destroy information above and beyond 1 and 0. But the color space transform node can even respect that information. But what it won't do well is like have those controls function, you know, well in that environment. So if I do, I'm just going to do the exact same thing I did before, which is I'm going to do the Arri log C and log C curve, and now I'm doing Rec 709 gamma 24, and I'm going to throw on tone mapping, and I'm going to throw on gap mapping. So this in performance, as you can see, that curve is really similar to that Arri LUT curve. It's not exactly the same, but it's pretty similar. Same thing. Offset controls work really elegantly before this, and the gain and gamma and lift controls do not work elegantly. And same thing afterwards. Offset controls work really clunkily afterwards, but the lift, gamma, gain controls work really elegantly afterwards. Make sense?
Awesome. Great demo on that.
Okay. Joe's got a good reaction. So Another thing to talk about is keying, which I think is a really common issue. So like keying before or after LUT, I'm just going to use a LUT as a shorthand here. Let's actually use a color space transform just to show you that they kind of work the same. I'm going to do S gamma at Cine 3, S log 3, and I'm doing timeline output. That's fine. So my timeline, by the way, this is respecting whatever my timeline settings are here. So it's doing Rec 709 gamma 24. So I'm just going to leave it at that. And I'm going to say simple and saturation mapping. Okay. So this is kind of like what that LUT looks like. Not exactly right, but similar. One thing I think people run into is that if you try and key before LUT versus after LUT, it can be a little more finicky. So I'm just going to switch to the qualifier here. I'm going to select the green, the skin, and you can see that like with that swipe, right, using sort of the default tools, it does a pretty wide selection, right? And if we do it after the LUT, actually I didn't do this to demo it, you can see it does a much narrower selection. Everybody seeing that? So before the LUT, let's do before the LUT. Same procedure. I swiped across his forehead. I get this very wide selection. After the LUT, same procedure. I swipe across his forehead. I get a narrow selection.
So you get a better secondary like selection after the LUT.
Yes and no. So
yes and no.
In terms of point and click operation, it's maybe easier. But in terms of the actual quality of the key and the differentiation between the color values, it shouldn't be any easier. It shouldn't be any different. Not easier, different. So what this LUT is doing is stretching out differences in color values, but it's not creating new differences. It's not creating new definition inside of those color values. If I look at this key here, I can tune my key here to sort of match that key more closely, right? So I can tune the low saturation here, and I can tune this, and you can get really similar results, right? It's pretty similar. I could tweak it some more, but you get the idea. Jamie, you agree? Similar results?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So the definition is there, the differentiation is there. Those hue values are still as narrow and relative to each other as they are before or after the LUT. That doesn't change. The only difference is that the differences are more exaggerated after the LUT, and so that point and click operation just works easier out of the box. The point and click operation is really designed to work in Rec 709, but the controls are 32-bit float, and so they are as fine and as fine-grained and as dialed in as it could be in either scenario. Now, why would you key in one versus the other? I almost always work log because I almost always use color management and do my output transforms after all of my operations. So my display transform is the last thing in my chain usually. And so that means I'm always keying log. And what that also means is that all my operations can be mathematically done in a way that is much more elegant than it can be in a video space. So video space operations you saw the tone mapping. We talked about tone mapping before. It scales down values. It adjusts the image to look nice. But that looking nice image doesn't necessarily reflect how the image behaves in the real world, right? It's an abstraction from the real world. And so that means the controls are also having to be abstracted from the way that we should behave in the real world. You go away from things like exposure and white balance controls and into lift, gamma, gain, color, wheel controls. And those are great. A lot of colorists like to just feel their way to a good image. I'm not one of those colorists. I like to find my way there with purpose, right? I like to get somewhere intentionally. And to do that, I need to kind of work more in a scene referred environment where the light and the data is behaving more the way it does in the real world. And so that log image gives me a really good idea, or the raw image gives me a really good way to do that. And I want to use it to the maximum effect. So doing things like, for example, skin manipulation, I can do all the same tools that I can in post effects and the hue versus hue or the color compressor. But like things that work really well are, for example, exposure adjustments. I can adjust exposure on skins really well and elegantly. I can adjust overall balance on skins really well and elegantly. That's a lot harder to do in the same mathematical way after the LUT.
Got it. Chris Bolton had a question. Would you ever do a key after the LUT and then apply the mask on the log input?
You can't really, because if you're doing a key, you're basing that on color value. So for example, if I'm going to reset this, I have a key for my skins here, and I'm going to feed this back into this, and which, by the way, you can do, although you really shouldn't be able to do, but you can do it. Let's see if I can do it. Maybe I can. Nope, won't let you do it. All right, they used to let you do it, which was kind of a disaster because you could get into kind of a sort of a paradoxical effect where the thing you're changing affects the pixels that you're changing. So if I'm taking this key and I'm using it to tweak my skin tones before the LUT, then guess what? My skin tones are going to change, and so the key is going to change. Now, what you could do, and I would really not recommend doing this, is you could do a transform into a video space and then do the transform out of the video space. So I can add a new node here, and I'm going to do, there. And I'm going to do a color space transform, and I'm going to say, well, this was the timeline space. I'm going to transform it back to the Sony S-Gamma, Sony S-Log space. Again, would not recommend this. And by the way, I have to turn off tone mapping because tone mapping clips information. So now if I turn off tone mapping, this actually works correctly. So now I can turn off tone mapping. And now I have the same key here, right? Oh, what did I do there? I have the same, wait, that's not the shadows working on. This is the shadows working on. I have the same key there, right? So now I can add another node, and now I can pull this key from here into here. And I should be able to do that. There we go. And now I can go through and manipulate using that key because I'm doing it after the source image. Don't do that. There's a lot of things that are wrong with this. I would not recommend it. The thing I do sometimes, and we're getting into the deep end of color space management stuff. Yeah. The thing I will do sometimes is I will actually convert use the color space transform tool to convert an image to actual true scene linear, because then things like, for example, fixing highlights or bringing back detail in clouds, it just works a lot better because true scene linear is actually like, basically exactly as it is in camera. So the gain, you turn the gain and you turn the lumens mix down to 0, and all of a sudden that gain control becomes an exactly mathematically correct exposure adjustment. So a 0.5 on the gain is 1 stop down, 0.25 is 2 stops down, 0.125 is 3 stops down and on. And so that's a really cool way, from my perspective, to like do certain things. So highlight recovery, if I have a blown out window and I want to bring it back in a really realistic way, I'll do it that way.
Hey, one quick question from John Spellman. He's saying that the way that you were talking about using like primary wheels before wheels control for the LUT, which is kind of how we work in LiveGrade, is it the same thing, or are we doing it the wrong way? Which, at least in Resolve terms, you know what I mean? Is it just different, or?
Well, so I think if I'm not mistaken, I'm not an expert in LiveGrade, but LiveGrade works more like a CDL kind of adjustment, right? So you have like slope, contrast, and lift. Right?
SOP.
You're basically doing it before the LUT, yeah.
Right. So those controls are like the offset controls and log controls in Resolve, in that they do work before the LUT correctly.
Oh. All right.
The equivalent in Resolve parlance would be offset, contrast, and pivot.
Got it. John, does that answer your question? Nate, and also, is there anything?
I guess I'm wondering, if you import the CDL, you're going to see those values in the primary wheels adjust.
Okay, John. If you import the CDL, you're going to see those. Before the LUT, yes.
I guess I'm wondering when you're saying it's not elegant, it might be the only choice we have, but that is how that's working essentially. When we give that CDL, that's
so the CDL values are different than what the value changes are in lift, gamma, gain controls in Resolve. So what happens when you import that CDL is the math gets done to convert those controls over to what they would have been in log space.
Okay, I got it.
But yeah, they're displayed in like lift, gamma, gain controls, but they're actually, the math they represent is more like the offset, contrast, and pivot controls.
Okay.
Awesome. Any other questions about this? We're going to move on to keyframing. Oh, Dave Satin has a question. Go ahead, Dave.
Just wondering, is there some easy, cheesy way that we've never heard of to map the offset, contrast, and pivot controls onto trackballs if you don't have the black magic panel? Say I'm using my element or my ripple or my my waves, or some way to get those.
So
really easily?
I think on the elements you can use them doing dial controls. So you do have access to those controls. No, there isn't an easy way to map those controls on other devices if they don't have them available.
But on Black, so the very best reason to buy any Blackmagic control surface is for that one thing, I would say, no?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of good reasons to buy the Blackmagic panels, but they're really good panels. The digitizers are really excellent. Those specific controls, the offset, it's really handy to have a ball for, because you're kind of working in 2 coordinates, X and Y, right?
Yeah.
And then you have the offset, master offset, which is represented by a ring, usually on the panels. I'm doing like this gesture with my hands. So for that control, yes, the panel becomes really useful. But for the contrast and pivot controls, I find like just clicking on the value and then dragging your mouse is pretty precise and pretty useful. So I don't know if you necessarily need a panel for those controls per se.
Thanks.
We're going to move on to keyframing, if everyone's okay with that. Basic overview of keyframing, especially like with tricky shots where you have to turn off the adjust keyframes or hide a mask and then bring it back in a couple frames later. And Nate is going to give us a demo on that.
Let me kill my screen here.
Let's see. So I had this shot here. It's like a pretty standard car driving off the screen. So let's disable this, make a new node. So first things up is just drawing a mat around the car.
This is something that comes up all the time on car commercials.
Yeah, all the time. And then this one is something, I mean, you're probably going to be doing more just like circles, you know, for this, but for like a show and tell for the DP, if it's like really something that they wanted to see, can be helpful. I do the feathering before, because once you start adding keyframes, your feathering is going to change. So if you say do this, I have everything pan, tilt, zoom, rotate, 3D selected, and click through it, you'll see that it kind of screws up. If we try without the 3D, that also screws up. The rotate is there, and that doesn't really need to be. So we get rid of the rotate, and that at least tracks with our car for the majority of the shot. And then from here on out, it would just be about keyframing. So we have our clip and our frame controls. So clip is going to be something, if you do an adjustment here, say stretch this out, that shape will stay through the whole shot. And if you do the frame controls is where you can actually make, you know, different keyframes in time, and the shape will change. So I know like a lot of times people get screwed up with that, is if they keep trying to make keyframes, but they're doing the clip, they're just changing the size of their window just over and over again without really making a change to it. So let's see, now that I got the car track to about here is where it drifts off. I'm just gonna highlight from here on and clear that selected track data so I'm not fighting against that after the fact. And then now that I've got that, I'm in frame mode, and now I'm gonna just start going through and making some frames. So you can select multiple points on your window if you hold shift, and you can make a box. And this is something that they added a couple versions ago you couldn't do this before, and it was the worst. So you can start doing this. You can also change the scale of it or the rotation of just individual points. so now we've gone from here, misses it a little bit here. So the rest now is just going to be kind of more of like a bit of a roto work. So now like it's making a new keyframe every time I touch the window. Geez.
And just so people know too, you can, if you need to make a keyframe, you can make like the smallest of nudges just to get a keyframe on the timeline if you needed to.
Right. Right. Let's see here. Let's see. So now that I've got this in like the new axis that the car is on, let's see, got the ass hanging out a little bit there. Now you could say turn that 3D back on and then keep tracking. I'm just gonna see like, so I'm gonna go frame by frame just so it doesn't screw up. Yeah, so it gets a little wide. Again, you can bring that back in. I'm going to undo that actually. So if you want to, you can go through and delete individual keyframes if you've done something that screwed you up. I was trying to show you guys that you can go back on. I mean, you can. It's just not working. I worked last night. But basically, if something's tripping you up, either pan, tilt, zoom, rotate, or 3D, you can turn it on or off rather than having to leave all of them on. And you can just do that wherever you want in the shot. And then you can also, rather than just working on your individual points, you can always go back to the transform and change your size, your pan. Let's put that there and take it off. And so now, a little bit of work there in this area, but pretty decent. These shots always take a bit of time, but that will be a quick tutorial of one way that you can do it.
Would you mind just showing us like now how you can affect the rest of the image once you have the car selected, like
Yeah. So
or inside or outside?
Yeah, the other thing that I'll normally do here, I'm going to use the one that I did yesterday. Is I usually don't adjust this. I'll just use this as a mask for the car, and so I'll do other things downstream. So just link that car that we just tracked to something else down the stream, and then from here you could then do that individually, or if you want to do the opposite, go over here. Sorry. And yeah, then you can see here you're doing everything outside of the car.
So node 2 is just a regular node, just so everyone knows, right?
This node here, oh, this was, yeah, node 2 is just a regular node, and you're just taking your mask data and just point it over to your second node.
There's a question about if you know the dynamics of movement in a shot with unclicking certain parameters like roll, tilt, pan, or whatever, or do you leave them all on until one gives you an issue, and then you can deselect like?
Oh yeah, no, totally. Because there's some things. The other thing
while you're tracking. Yeah,
I mean the other thing that happens too. Say if you were to leave 3D on all the time, just gonna do something rough. The 3D can warp, and then once it warps too much, like on your Z axis or your pitch and yaw, like when you want to try to do keyframes and pull it back, I find that you're working really hard against yourself to undo that. And then, yeah, I mean, if there's not a lot of movement like this, if you can just see that it's like going up and down, then yeah, just selecting pan and tilt can sometimes make your life easier. Because it's for one instance, car wheels is I run into all the time. Is if you try to put a circle on there because you want to do something to the rims, and you leave rotate on, like your mask can start spinning. You know, so if you turn rotate off, it's just going to follow the X and Y rather than trying to spin with the rim.
Great example. Hey Juan, did you have anything you want to add to this?
I have a few things. Nate, would you mind if I drive your screen for a second?
Oh yeah.
If you share it again, I can request control. Cool. Requesting control now.
Right. Just kidding. Let's see. Hold on 1 sec. All right. Try it one more time.
Oh, sure.
Hey.
There you go. Okay, so I'm just gonna quickly, well, I'll create a new version just to not delete your stuff here. So create a new version and we'll just reset this thing. So one thing to keep in mind about the tracker is what you want in tracking in general, just like rotoscoping, what you want to do is break things down into like their component movement, component perspectives, right? So this car is a great example of like, you have fixed planes, right? We have a few planes. We have the front of the car. We have the side of the car is all one plane. The windshield is another plane. The tires are a different plane, maybe. So you have these sort of fixed, rigid planes. And so if you break things like this down into it's a lot easier than, for example, organic shapes that have like distort and change, right? Like flags are impossible to like get a good track on because they distort and change all the time. But this has like nice rigid geometry that you can actually kind of like have some points of contrast and actually track things. So one thing to do as you're kind of deciding how you're going to approach things is actually like try to basically utilize the geometry to your advantage. So in this case, I can actually do a couple things. So I'm actually gonna start by basically just tracking. I'm just gonna move this one thing. I'm just gonna start by tracking just the grill. The grill has a lot of definition. It's not going to track the whole way through because the shot kind of goes out of the way, but it has a lot of definition. It has rigid geometry. It's all on one plane. So I can say, leave all these things enabled, and I'm just going to track backwards here. And so that's stuck perfectly, right? That really good sticking there. And I can track forward, and I'll get it up until it kind of goes off camera. I'm only going to do a little bit of the shot, so I'm not going to do the whole thing. So we'll talk about what to do there another time. So now I have this really good track of the grill as it's passing through camera, right? It's spot on, but it's only the grill, and I really need more than the grill. So the perspective change on that shape tracks the perspective of that grill. Everything else that's in the same perspective as that grill, that's in the same plane as it, can track with it. All I need to do is, instead of like tweaking the individual frames, I want to do clip manipulations. And here I can now take this and I can start extending out these points to basically include the whole front of the grill. I'm going to do a really rough version because I don't want to have to cut through the whole thing. But you notice I'm only using this up to the edge of that plane. I'm not going beyond that plane. I don't want to get any other pixels because they're going to get messed up. I don't want to get any pixels over on the hood. I don't want to get pixels over on the side of the car. I just want to use that plane. So I'm going to go through and tweak this and this and get the hood here, right? And so now I have this track that I can tweak a little bit more if I wanted to. I might need to do a couple of keyframes, but it's not going to be much. So I have the track. You'll notice I'm not adding individual keyframes to the thing with these manipulations. I'm only making manipulations to the whole clip. It's affecting the whole run of the shape. So I'm just gonna go through, like, kind of see where, and it breaks here. Great. So it breaks, it's good up until around, let's see where it ends up breaking.
I was fighting you with my mouse, my bad.
Oh, sorry. So it's good up until, let's say it's good up until about here. It's not quite good, but let's say it is. So now I can go through and say individual frame adjustments, and I'm just going to go through and tweak this a little bit here and tweak this a little here to get it more in line. And I can go back here and see how it holds up. Great. I'm only worrying about one side right now. I'm going to go up to here, and now I can see that the whole thing is out of whack a little bit. So I can go through and, how did you select the range? It was shift, right?
Shift, yeah.
So, whoops. Controls are a little funky here. Okay, so select the range. I can shrink this down a little bit. Go over here, shrink this up a little bit. And then deselect it, and then I can tweak these individual things. So I can go over here. Let's say that's good enough for now. So you can see that's already adjusting my shape, just as you showed, Nate. That's already adjusting my shape. I'm going to ignore this part for now. Great. So I have one plane. There's another plane here, right? So there's also this, whoops. There's also the side of the car. This whole side is also a plane. So I'm going to go through and create another shape. I'm not worrying about feathering yet. I'm not doing any of those things. I'm just going to go through and create another shape. And now I'm going to kind of grab the parts that have like good geometry, good tracking features. I don't want reflections. You see the reflections here? I don't want those included because that will mess up my track. And now I can say, okay, let's track this backwards, and it'll track, and the perspective moves with it. There's probably, it gets a little funky at the end there. We'll deal with that later. But you can see I got like that track to go through. I can go to the next keyframe and say, I'm going to track forward from here. And this is going to go to almost the end of the shot. Great. So now, good. I've got this kind of perspective matching thing. I'm just going to, again, adjust the clip, not the frame. I'm going to go through and, like, in the shape, I'm going to extend this out. You can also add points, right? So if you want to add a point, you can add a point here. So if you need to add that. And when you add a point, it'll automatically generate sort of keyframes for that point along the entire path, wherever that point in the line was. So I can tweak this a little bit, tweak that a little bit. And now I have okay geometry. I want to try to include this part here. And I'm going to try to include this here. And again, I'm just doing a very rough shape here. I don't want to get too fine with it. I'm not trying to do a precise roto because that's going to take too much time. But you get the idea, right? So by breaking it down to component perspectives, I'm able to do that track in an automatic way for a lot of it, rather than going through and trying to distort a shape that fits one perspective to match another perspective. I'm just using the natural perspectives of the object to sort of get that track. I could do a third one. I would probably track, for example, up here to get the perspective of the hood. So I might, if I can add a shape here, there we go. So I might add a shape here, 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 here. And by the way, that's another thing I want to show you. I'm using offsets here. So I'm tracking one part of the ultimate perspective of the ultimate plane. I'm tracking just one part of it that has good contrast, good points of reference, that doesn't have reflections. And then I'm using that movement to extract out the movement for all the rest of that plane that matches it. So again, here I can track forward. It's fine. And I can go back to the previous keyframe and I can track backwards. Not great, but okay. And then now I can take this plane and I can manipulate it. And I can also, by the way, you can copy track data from one shape to another. So if I added, say, a rectangular shape and I wanted to copy the track data from this shape, which, by the way, you can name shapes. So if I want to rename this shape, where is it? You have to take there it is, name. So I can name the shape whatever I want. So if I'm if I have a node with like 15 shapes, I want to keep track of what the shapes are. By the way, cars are the hardest to do of any object because it's just, it's all geometry, it's all distorting, and it's very precise, right? Often when we're doing car spots, they're like, can I get a little glint on the driver's side mirror? And like, that's the one thing they want. You have to like track that, and it's a lot more work than like other stuff. So anyway, so what I can do is like, I can select this, you can see that I've presently selected that windshield track, and here's my tracking information for that windshield. And I can say, copy track data, and then I can go to this other object, excuse me, and I can say paste track data. And now that tracking information gets carried over from one to the other, and so the distortion gets applied to that shape. Everybody seeing that?
Yeah.
So that's an easy way to kind of borrow tracking information from one thing to another. Nate, if you want to end it, I can sort of jump on my screen and show something else.
Sure. You want to show? Well, the other thing I was just say real quick is you can use a key mixer and do several nodes that you could turn, fade on and off.
So you can build out a bunch of nodes with like individual objects and then combine them in the key mixer. One thing before we go, I just want to show really quickly is that, one thing I didn't do that Nate, you did was add that feathering at the top. And I think that you correctly said that the reason you did that is because it messes up your keyframes, and it normally would. But what I did was I had no feathering, which I think works better for tracking anyway, because you can kind of narrow the number of pixels that you're sort of picking up in that track. And then if I switch to clip mode again, and this only works, what this does is it adjusts the feathering relative. So if you have a little bit of feathering in one part and a lot of feathering in another part, and then you increase the feathering overall, it's going to give you a relative increase in feathering. So if you increase it 10%, it's going to be 10% for all of them. In this case, because I have 0 feathering, it doesn't matter. And so I can pick a shape. I'm going to pick the hood shape here, and I can say add the inside, add the outside, and add some softness. And so now if I do the highlight here, you can see I have that's very soft, but let's make it less soft. You can see that I have this feather on that shape. And as I scrub through, it's automatically added it to all of the keyframes. Now, if I wanted to go through and say, because this feather is too narrow, let's say when the car is up close, and it's too feathered when the car is far away, because it's absolute, it's the number of pixels that it's feathering. If I wanted to keyframe that, then yes, what I would have to do is go through each one of these keyframes and adjust the feathering there. So keyframe by keyframe, you'd have to adjust it.
There was a question to elaborate a little bit more on the key mixer, Juan.
Yeah. So Nate, do you want to let go, and I'll actually show that in my thing if you want.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, so I was trying to find Nate inspired me with the car shot. I was trying to find like a stock car shot that I could use to sort of demo that. I couldn't really find a good one. So that's why. Thanks, Nate, for letting me use your shot there. I'm going to take a pretty nightmare scenario for tracking. Let's say that I wanted to, I'm just going to turn off my open effects, and I'm going to extend this out.
This is perfect for like hiding a window or turning it back and off and on for a couple frames.
Correct. So there's a couple of things that are problematic here. One, this guy's moving relatively quickly and is blurred to shit. So if I tried to, let's say I avoided the obstacles in the way, but just simply tried to just track him, right? I'm just going to zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to try and track center mass. The way the tracker works is it tries to find points of contrast, and then it tries to follow those points of contrast from one frame to another. When you have crazy motion blur like this, crazy perspective change like this, crazy fast pixel movement like this, it's going to have a really hard time tracking those pixels from one frame to another. So as I go through, and let's say I'm going to turn off 3D perspective, I don't need zoom, I don't need rotate, I just need it to do pan and tilt, right? So if I try and track him forward, it loses him right away. My system's very fast, so unfortunately, it's hard to see where it lost it. But it gets to this point where his center mass pixels are really similar to the background, and then when he crosses that point, it's like, I like this background, let's stick here. Too much movement, it was moving too quickly, I don't want to follow it anymore, I'm tired of this shit. So this makes it really tricky to track this, right? After seeing this on this shot, I wouldn't even bother trying to track it. I'm just gonna fucking do it manually. And I'm gonna show you really quickly how you can do that. So real scenario here, let's say I'm trying to just highlight him a little bit. So I just want like a big soft window around him just to kind of up the contrast around him to highlight him a little bit in the shot. So you can kind of, I'm gonna throw that LUT back on so we kind of see it more normally. By the way, the LUT makes no difference to the tracker, in case anybody was wondering.
Thank you for mentioning that.
So I know that this shot basically runs the length of his run across the scene. So I know that he essentially ends at the end and starts at the beginning, right? So I can go through and say, use that same technique that Nate was showing without the tracker, just with the frame turned on here. And it's going to automatically create a keyframe. So I'm starting a keyframe right here on the first frame that he's visible. And I'm scrubbing through the last frame that he's visible. And I'm going to add another keyframe there. With me? So what has happened is it's interpreted all the frames in between that. So as he starts running through, you can see it kind of tries to follow him, but obviously the velocity of his movement is not the same as the velocity of the pixels across the screen. So it's not necessarily going to keep up perfectly. But it does pretty well for the first 2 frames, and it does pretty well right at the end, right? So here it's great. I like where he is right there. I want to keep that velocity consistent the whole time. So I'm just going to add another keyframe right here because I like where it is from here through to the end. So I just added another keyframe. That creates interpretation between that frame and that frame that's consistent. I'm gonna add one more keyframe just to move the window off screen here.
Would you explain that you just made a little wiggle on the shape to add a keyframe?
Correct, and that's exactly what I did. So I just wiggled the shape a little bit. I kind of tuned it a little bit more, and it created this little diamond keyframe on my frame window. Because I'm in frame mode, if I was in clip mode, it would not do that. So now, good. I've got this part to this part I'm really happy with, and the first frame is good, and then it turns to shit pretty quickly. So by the time he gets here, he's too far ahead. I'm going to go right to the middle of where this is, and I'm going to adjust the movement there. So I'm going to adjust that to here. So now going back, it's a lot better. It's a little bit off. It's mostly the peak of it being off is here. I'm looking at the velocity of the movement, the flow of the movement, and I'm trying to find the points at which the movement velocity changes, increases or decreases. In this case, he's kind of coming around the corner. So that's changing the amount of pixels that he's moving from one frame to the next. So, you can see that's sticking pretty well. That's sticking well. This is going well. This is pretty good. I've got him windowed pretty good. I was doing it much slower than I would in real life because I was trying to explain it to you guys. So in about 20 seconds, I could track him by hand. Now, it's easy because the lock shot and he's the only thing moving in the shot. It gets a lot harder when the camera's moving and the actor's moving, right? So that makes it a lot more difficult. In this case, it's relatively easy. Now, in this particular case, what I want to do is have a really soft feather on the shape. So now I'm going to switch back into clip mode, and I'm going to go back to my window, and I'm going to increase that softness and have a really soft feather on the shape, and I'm going to just expand the window a little bit so it's inclusive of that. And I just want the subtlest effect here. I don't want to go too heavy with it. I just want a subtle effect. I'm going to make the shot black and white just to make it interesting. I'm going to go here. So monochrome, and then I'm going to pump up the contrast a little bit just to kind of give it some oomph. Not that much, guys. Not that much. Whoa.
You're still in timeline mode.
Yeah, I know. I'm intentionally in
Okay.
timeline mode. My controls are being a little wacky. Hang on a second. Okay, let's say this is what I want, right? I got some contrast. It's black and white. It's contrasty. It's kind of noirish. And I just want to make sure that what I'm going to do is bring down the gamma a little bit. I just want to make sure that the feel of this is you see him really clearly. He's popping out of frame. So I'm going to take not the set. I'm going to take his window effect, and I'm just going to boost the shadow a little bit. So we're going to go to shadow mode. I'm just going to boost the shadow a little bit so he comes across a little cleaner. I'm going to boost the mid-tone detail so he cuts through the scene. So you can see it's making him pop out a little bit more, right? It's maybe too much because you can really see the feather. But the big reason you can see the feather is because he crosses this fucking object, and that looks weird, right? So he's crossing these objects. The objects are lighting up. They shouldn't be lighting up because the light should be on him, not on the object. I'm going to also just reduce the effect here a little bit just to kind of make it a little more palatable. All right. So what I need to do is find a way to bypass these two objects which are fixed. I'm going to show it to you two different ways. One with the layer mixer, just to show you layer mixer. But I'm going to quickly show just the add layer. This is I'm going to add a layer. So this is just adding that same layer node. Like we talked about this before. The bottom node is basically those pixels are above the pixels underneath it or behind it. So in this case, you can see that the effect has been completely bypassed because we added this effect on top of it. It's bypassing the windows. I'm lucky in that these shapes are pretty rigid. So I can go through and I can just very quickly, you know, do pretty fine, let's add a curve. I can do a pretty fine shape tracking these things pretty closely. I'm not going to do a great job here, but just want to quickly. And this part of the image doesn't matter. I'm just going to do really wide. So over here, good. Over here, good. Whoops. By the way, I'm middle mouse clicking to like move around the window in case anyone was wondering how that works. And over here, and good. And then I'm going to go really wide here. Okay, cool. Now, if I want to add some softness to this, I can do a little inside softness. Obviously, I want some sharpness right on the column itself because it's a pretty well-defined structure. But I want some softness as it feathers out here. So I'm going to just do this and this and this to feather out the effect as it kind of approaches that thing so it's not quite so harsh. Gonna do a little bit more here. And same thing above. So what I'm doing there is I'm grabbing the inside and outside points individually and moving them individually. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah, what's the thought process for this particular object? Why are you doing it like that?
Because, so this effect, I'm going to show you what it looks like on this frame. So this effect highlights him, right? And it sort of feathers, it's really soft feather, and it's feathering out as it goes up above here, and it's feathering out as it goes down below here. So I don't want to have too sharp of a line. I don't want to have to cut out this in too much detail because this effect, I want this effect to taper off as it kind of comes down to this end of the sidewalk, and I want it to taper off as it comes up here. So, but I don't want to, I could do this a few other ways. So I could use multiple masks in order to do this. I'm just doing it this way because I'm in this mask mode, but I could use a couple of different masks. So if, for example, let's say I didn't do this feather and I just wanted to like, actually, let me see if I can adjust it. There we go.
No,
all
it's
right,
great.
so
It makes sense.
I just turned off my feather, right? So my mask is really sharp again. And what I want to do is feather out the effect here and feather out the effect here. I can go through and add a gradient. And so you can see that that's now including this, but I actually want it to exclude. So I can say exclude. And so now this gradient is excluding the other mask from this selection. Make sense? So effectively, this is doing the same thing I was doing. It's just doing it in a different way. And I can do another, I can add another gradient and flip that one around and to invert that one. No, actually it's not invert, it's mask. And then go down here and, you know, do the same thing here. So I'm gonna soften that gradient, soften this gradient. With me?
Yep.
Okay. So effectively, I'm doing the same thing there. Either way, one way is sort of, you know, more picky than the other way. And now what you're seeing is you see that effect that's on behind him, and I've got it exaggerated so you can really see it. It's not affecting that column. See that?
Awesome. That's great.
So it's effectively bypassing that column. Excuse me. I'm going to soften that up a little bit. So now when it comes over here, lamppost, same thing. I've got the same issue. Let's do it the other way. Let's do it with the layer mixer to show you what that looks like. So I'm going to add another node here. I'm going to select this node with this. So again, I could do this other mask right here in the same node. I'm doing it in this other node just to show you another way of doing this, right? So keep that in mind. All right, so I can select. I'm going to just even faster here. I'm just going to draw a really quick shape just around this sign. Up to here. And I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to do it really rough just to show you very quickly. Okay, this is not good enough, but let's say it is good enough. So this is not feeding into anything right now. This is just a masking of itself. I'm going to go through here and I'm going to say add a layer mixer. Oh, no, sorry. I'm going to add a key mixer. So now I've got this key mixer. I can take this key from here and I can see it here. This just shows you the mask, the mat, sorry. I can take that mat, so I have that mat and I want to subtract from it this mat. So I can select this, send it over here. Whoops, select this, send it over here. And so now it's combining the two mats. And if I want to make it subtract that mask from the other one, I can flip the output of this mask. So there's always like 2 or 3 ways to skin a cat in Resolve. So I can flip the output of this mask, and now I've got the mask subtracting that, although that's not exactly what I want. Or I can, even easier, I can say, flip this. And why isn't this doing it the right way? Let's see. What am I doing wrong? What am I doing wrong? I want to flip that. I want to avoid that. Oh, maybe I need to flip the order. There we go. Nope, that's not it. Flip this. Not it. Interesting. I need to, let's see if I can flip this guy. And yeah, so this will exclude, this excludes the lamppost from the background. And I could take this and apply it to another node. Oh, I wouldn't do it this way. All right, we'll come back to this one because this is not exactly what I want to do. So let me just quickly show you how I can reuse this information. So I've already done this mask. So I can do a couple of things. One, I could take this. I've already done the mask. The node structure didn't work the way I want it to right now. I can either take this window and apply it into a new window here. So I can add a curve window. I can say paste window. And now I've added this window to my one node. So now I've got this window applied. I can flip it or flop it. Wait, what is it? Is that and this? What did I do wrong there? Huh. There we go. Or I can take this guy and just say add another node, add another input. I just remove one input. I can say add an input. There it is. And now I can take this and feed it into there. And what I want to do is actually flop this. There we go. So now I've got that effect doing what I want there. It seems to be, oh, because I've flipped this around, that's why. There we go. So now I've got it bypassing that thing. There is a way to do it with that key mixer. I'm screwing up somewhere. The easiest thing to do with the key mixer, by the way, is, for example, if I have these 2 keys and I just want to combine them into one key, I can just very quickly say add key mixer. So I've got this key and I want to make them one key. I can say add key mixer, apply the same key to both. I'm going to add a node here. I'm going to remove one attribute, remove one input, sorry. And I'm going to feed the source image into this node, and then I'm going to feed it this key. And now I've got, you see what I did there? So I've got one node with both keys. It's got this key and it's got this key, and they're combined in this key mixer. And then it's being applied to this one node with both keys. And then I can apply that to my layer. And I get the desired result.
Sweet. I think Nate had a comment or something he wanted to demo real quick.
Nate, I think you're muted.
Or Juan, if you want to show it too. Just going over keyframing for the node itself, or for the shot itself, and like separating master versus color sizing, and then individual components of each shot, or of each node, I should say.
Do you want to show us on your screen, Nate?
Yeah, sure.
And we'll, just so you guys know, we'll move on from this. We have about an hour left with Juan, so we're going to try to get through the rest of the agenda if we can.
All right, so I'll just show quick, because this one comes up a lot of you know, driving stuff. If you're going like in and out of shadow, or you have to do some sort of dynamic correction. Down here for our keyframes, by default, I believe it's always on all. So as soon as you make a new keyframe, let's see.
Nate, make sure you're sharing your screen.
Oh, that would be helpful.
Yeah.
Juan, help me out. What is the command for adding a keyframe? It's on my Stream Deck, and my Stream Deck is not on my laptop. I'm totally spacing.
It's the right bracket key.
Right bracket.
Or you might have it mapped to something else.
If you want to do it in the menu, it's in, I think it's color. Let me see here.
I think it's command left or right bracket.
Yes, that's for adding the keyframe. But if you want to do it in the, from the UI, can you guys hear me or?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
That's what I'm totally spacing on. Add keyframe. Here it's on mark.
It's on mark, yeah.
It is control bracket.
And there's two kinds. There's static keyframes and normal keyframes. They used to be called dynamic keyframes, and now it's just keyframes. Static keyframes is like if you use After Effects at all, it's as if you're using, I forget what it's called, straight transition, where it basically just has one setting until the keyframe, and then it has another setting after the keyframe. There's no kind of elegant transition from one to the other. It's just one setting, another setting. So static keyframes are good for if you have like a sequence that is multiple clips in the same shot, and you want to like have one grade for one clip, another grade for another clip. You add a static keyframe. Or if you have like a lens, a flash, a camera flash in a single frame, you would use the static keyframe.
Gotcha. Yeah. So anyways, what I was trying to show is like, say if there's something that happens exposure-wise in a shot, and you need to go darker for whatever reason. This is not an appropriate shot, but just for the demo. If we want it off, a lot of times you'll add a keyframe, and then all of a sudden you've added keyframes for every aspect of that node, when all you want to do is just to turn it on or off. So if you, rather than all, you'll be in color, and say like defocus is what you would want to do for this one. Then you can add a keyframe and then go to your key output. And now you've only made a keyframe just for turning this node on and off, rather than if you happen to make a keyframe without this selected, it's going to make a keyframe for everything. So if you accidentally go back and change like a lift gamma gain, it's going to change the color correction. Or if you changed the shape of a window, it's going to change that as well. So just want to throw that in there for keyframing. That would be a helpful thing that might run into.
And just to add, we talked about static, but what you did right there is you have dynamic keyframes. So the first one next to defocus is your start value, and then your second one is your end value, and Resolve is just going to interpolate the fade, if you will, between those two values when you see that shape.
Yeah, and one thing to note is that the static keyframes are still retain their name, but the other keyframes, which are just normal keyframes, they used to be called dynamic keyframes. So if you see like old documentation or old comments mentioning a dynamic keyframe, that's now just called a keyframe.
Got it.
Yeah. And like likewise, if you select this and you want to make some other adjustments, that's how you can, rather than having to make a new keyframe, it'll make a new keyframe for you. You have things you want to turn off and on. Yeah.
So, Nate, I don't know if maybe it's easier for me to control your machine or switch viewers. I would just want to show. Did you show like the master, like color and sizing versus just color?
No. So I'm just going to give you back control. Show on your end.
Cool. You guys see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm just going to quickly reset my timeline grid here and go back to my clip grid. So let's say that in this particular case, I was writing exposure, let's say, which actually something that happens. This is like a daylight window, and so sometimes the exposure goes up, exposure goes down, or rather the sky, the brightness goes up, brightness goes down. I'm going to just quickly add a LUT to this just so we can see it properly displayed. Okay, so let's say I wanted to ride the brightness over the course of this take. There's two things, Nate, you did a great job in terms of showing the keyframing. There's one thing I would point out is there are sizing controls that apply sort of throughout the sequence. And so these sizing controls can, if you have it set to just automatically create keyframes, or if you're creating a keyframe manually, you will affect the sizing controls, including things like blanking. So if you have output sizing, and let's say I have my blanking turned on here, and I'm just gonna, yeah, that's fine. I'm gonna turn my blanking on there and there, right? So now I'm gonna automatically create keyframes and sizing. And so now you just created a keyframe there. And if I go down here and I remove that effect, you'll see that there is now a transition to the letterbox, right? So that's affecting at the timeline level, not at the clip level. It's rarely the case that you actually want this to happen. So I would strongly advise to make sure that you're only affecting color rather than all, and only adjust sizing if you want to adjust sizing to the whole timeline, and only do it in the sizing mode. Don't do it in the regular mode. I'm just going to quickly delete these keyframes. Whether you can select the keyframe, hit delete, it'll delete the keyframe in case you get stuck. Okay, so I'm going to turn off the automatic keyframing for this. Go back into the color mode. In color mode, I'm just affecting the individual clips when I'm in clip mode. So now I can add a. I'm just going to add a node before this. So I've got two nodes. I've got node 1 and node 2. And you can see here that there's corrector 1 and corrector 2 that represents the nodes. So the node numbers follows the corrector numbers in your keyframe window. So most often, what I want to do is only add keyframes on a specific node. If you go to the mark, add a keyframe, it will add a keyframe. If you, in this case, it's adding it on sizing. I don't know why. If you're in color and you say mark, add a keyframe, it will add a keyframe on that specific node. If you say add a keyframe on all and you say mark, add a keyframe, it will add a keyframe across everything. So what you want to do is most often, I think, you want to just be in color mode. You do not want to be in all mode, and you almost certainly don't want to be in sizing mode. And when you're in color mode, what I like to do is rather than add a keyframe manually, I just turn on the auto keyframing only when I actually want to do the keyframes. So in that case, if, for example, on this shot, I wanted to ride the exposure, let's say down over the course of the shot, I would turn on auto keyframe. I would have my offset, I would just wiggle my offset to create one keyframe. So a little faster there. And then I would go to the end of it and I would add another keyframe and just modify my exposure, and I would bring that exposure down. So now it has dynamically added this adjustment over the course of the shot. And this is really cool for when you have like an iris change, which happens particularly like, reality TV or like, or documentary stuff. I'll end up with like stuff with iris changes regularly. Oh, one thing I'd point out here is like this gets a little funky in terms of updating the values. So it doesn't always show you the current value when you're on the UI. So you got to just make sure that you've landed on the keyframe by selecting the keyframe, and then you can ride that value, and then you're modifying that keyframe. If I'm one frame off, so if I'm one frame back and I adjust the value here, that's weird. It will now create new interpretations between that frame and that frame, and then it'll jump to the next value. So what I did there was I accidentally created a new keyframe in between two other keyframes. So that's really critical. You can, by the way, you can zoom in, and so you can see where the individual keyframes are. And if you do that by accident, you can go through, select that keyframe, and then delete that keyframe. So now it's interpreting it the way that I wanted it to, rather than the way it was doing it, the wrong way before. One thing that happens a lot is you'll have like a little iris change where you'll have a before exposure, the change in the iris, and then an after exposure. And you want the after exposure to stay where it is and the before exposure to stay where it is. And you just want to tweak the adjustment in the middle of the iris change. So the way to do that is you'll actually go through and like find the frame where it's good, find the other frame where it's good, and create another keyframe there, and then go back and adjust it in the in between. So you're adjusting it, during the exposure change, at the peak of the exposure change, making the adjustment. Usually you use a still reference, match the exposure, and then go through and scrub through it. And sometimes you'll have a little kind of tweaky stuff because it's not quite a linear exposure adjustment. Sometimes it's a little soft. So you'll have to go through and like tweak a frame here, tweak a frame there to get it to line up just right.
Awesome. Hey, to move on from keyframing, anyone have any questions before we move on? If not, we wanted to move on to something people were asking about for on-set work was like staying organized with versioning. So if you have a DP that hasn't quite made up their mind yet, and Nate and I were talking about this, you can show the multiple viewer with multiple like grades that you're kind of thinking about. And then Nate, if you wouldn't mind covering like the version naming, et cetera, so that you know like which is version 1, version 2, version 3, et cetera.
Yep. So let's see here. This is admittedly where I get sloppy and get confused. Basically, every time that you're going to make a new version, Command Y, I would just keep renaming it as you go along. So let's go like local 1, a new version. Let's make this one warm.
You can really get lost in the weeds with versioning if you don't stay organized.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say like immediately label them, and then when you're here in view, let's see. Timeline thumbnail info is default to codec, and you can switch that to version so you can easily see like what you're on, which makes it a lot faster when you're like auditioning stuff for DPs. But it only works as if you're labeling your things correctly. But lots of times like you'll be making lots of versions and they're very subtly different and you gotta label them quick. And then just, to go back to what we showed before in the viewer window, you can do the version and original or versions and audition looks that way. What was that? Jamie?
What's up?
Jamie, I don't know, Nate, if I could just add that the keyboard shortcuts for adding a new version, I believe it's Control Y to add a new version is the default, but the keyboard shortcuts become really handy if you don't have a panel or like a Stream Deck. I don't even think the advanced panel lets you do versions, but add versions, but I don't know if the mini panel lets you add versions. I don't think it does, like on the panel.
No, I got that on my Stream Deck.
Yeah. So if you got, I'm sure a lot of you know about Stream Decks. Like I think they're pretty popular on carts. So really, really handy thing is to just set keyboard shortcuts for add a new version and for previous and next version, and then map those to like Stream Deck or whatever you can, so that you're just really able to really quickly toggle through versions. I really love to be able to go up and quickly jump through version 1, version 2, version 3, version 4.
Nice.
Yeah.
Joe Bellick has a question. Joe, go ahead. Make sure you unmute yourself.
Yeah. It's not as much a question, just a comment about versioning in the commercial world. I've just found that, like, I don't know, everyone's got their own workflow, especially in commercials where it's like a bit of the Wild West with how people work with their DPs and everything. But like laying out even 2 or 3 versions ahead of a DP's requests to make tweaks. Like if you generally know, this DP just generally likes to work with these kind of film emulation LUTs or whatever. I found that the first time they come over to the cart, if you even have 2 or 3 different versions that are different enough to point them in a direction, that can be the difference between a DP sitting with you, having one of those kind of thumb twiddling conversations that sometimes like is crappy, and a DP coming over and being like, yes, that one, love it, just lower the saturation, awesome, and right there, you know, it's just an easy way to have like a super good interaction with a DP, whether it's the first time or the 20th time you work with them, and be efficient. And it's way less kind of like chasing your tail. So just a sidebar comment.
Anticipation is key.
Well, I think that it's an interesting philosophical difference between the stuff we do in the finishing side and the stuff that's done on set. Because in the finishing side, I find that the thing to do is have a kind of confidence about like, this is the way the shot should be. You know what I mean? Like if you come in and say, this is what the shot needs, I think that kind of inspires some sort of confidence in I'm dealing with the directors more than the DPs, but the DP too, where you're kind of coming at it with like a perspective of what the end product should be, as opposed to like, here's 5 versions, pick one you like best, you know? But that might just maybe like a difference between on set and in post. Did we lose Jamie?
Shit, we're on our own.
It's a wild west. He did send me a message about covering group grading. So should we talk about that?
Yeah, I'm gonna give you the screen. I'll let you go over that.
So just heads up, guys, I'm not looking at the chat window or anything, so I may miss questions. So if I do, then we'll come back when Jamie shows back up, and he'll probably give us some info on that. So group grades are really, really handy, particularly in the narrative stuff. You can even use it as a kind of like almost like a versioning process. So like, I don't know why this isn't reset. Oh, because I'm in sizing. By the way, important to note, when you're in sizing, it doesn't let you manipulate the color nodes and vice versa. So I actually have to switch to color or all in order to reset my grade. A narrative stuff, there's all kinds of different ways, or documentary, long form, anything. There's all kinds of different ways to use groups. The most obvious is obviously like taking the same setup, same shot, and just combining them all into one group that you can grade. So the way a group works, just to give you guys a heads up on this, so that in case some of you maybe haven't dealt with groups before, I'm just going to quickly reset all these. So you can actually right click on a bunch of clips. So let's say I'm taking these 4 clips here. I can right click and say add into a new group, and it'll prompt me to name the group, and I'm going to call this interrogation scene. Never mind the spelling. That lets me quickly take all those shots together, and now I have these 2 new nubs right here in my grade window. I have group pre-clip, clip, and group post-clip, and then timeline. So what this lets me do is make adjustments to the group either before the individual clip grades in the order of operations, or after the individual clip grades in the order of operations. So things like, for example, let's say I do balancing on the overall shots. So I'm just going to quickly go through and say, I'm just going to kind of balance these all kind of cool. So now I'm doing individual shots here. So you can see like I'm taking 1 shot purple, 1 shot green, 1 shot blue, right? I have different grades. I'm going to go way more blue here. Different grades on these shots, right? Those are the individual shots. But then overall in the post group post clip, I'm able to go through and tweak that to all of those shots. So now, for example, I can make them all black and white. So now I went from having the individual color shots to having all of these shots black and white, and it's being applied to all of those clips at once. I can even go through and say, I'm just going to reset this. I can go through and say, do something in group pre-clip. So let's say I wanted to, for example, overall make the shot darker. DP comes in, he's like, I want this whole scene to be kind of dark and moody. Well, those darkening things get a little funky if you do it after the clip grade, because the clip grade can have windows and things like that that might be affected differently in terms of that darkening if you do it after the clip grade. So in group pre-clip, I can go through and say, bring down the offset, make all those shots darker. So now I've got all these shots darker and moodier than they were before. And they still have the color cast. If I want to do group post clip, I can do something like, raise the saturation here to exaggerate this even more. So now I've got this more exaggerated group post clip. You would never do this, but you get the idea. Another way that group can be handy is, and it's kind of like what Nate was showing before with versions, right? You can actually create multiple groups. So I can say, add another group here. So this is my saturated contrasty group. I'm going to create a new group, and I'm going to call it, this is my BW group. So in here, I'm just going to go through in the group post clip, and I'm going to just make everything black and white. And I'm going to make it, let's make it contrasty, right? So I've got this contrasty black and white shot, and I've got this colorized shots. Now let's say I want to make this shot more like the black and white shot. I want to borrow that look from the black and white shot. I can move it from one group to another. So I can say group, I can say black and white, and I can say assign to this group. So now we'll move all of its group processes from the first group, the interrogation scene group, into the black and white scene group. So now I can see that it's applied that effect to this clip. So you can use groups as kind of almost like versioning that you want to apply across a bunch of shots. So you can do like, you know, look 1, look 2, look 3, and kind of cycle through those looks very quickly by just assigning it to a different group. What else do I want to show you about groups? I mean, the big thing for me in terms of using groups is like, for example, it's like setups where I have like the same setup. So this is a really similar setup, these two shots. There's some exposure differences and some other things. So I might have a look, I might create a new group here and call this, call it cafe. So I've got this group for my cafe grades. I could have a look for this scene that I've dialed in. That's my look for the scene. And at the same time, on the individual clips where I'm having to adjust for things like, you know, white balance and exposure, I can make those adjustmts on the individual clip. What's really handy is I can go through and do the balance pass without a stylized look. I can just do the default LUTs, the default 709 LUTs, do my balance pass on the clip grades, and then apply a stylized look in the group grade.
Perfect. That's a great usage for us on set, for sure. I think you want to talk about shared nodes as well.
Oh yeah, let's touch on that. So there's a couple of ways. These are both of these are examples of ways to apply grades across multiple shots, right? So another way to apply a grade across multiple shot, if you have a specific, let's say you have a single node look node. So I'm just going to quickly reset this. Actually, you know what? I'm going to turn this. This is my color transform. Remember we did this earlier where I did the color transform with the tone mapping turned on. So let's say that this was my look, and I wanted to apply this to these other shots. I could very quickly go right-click on this and say save a shared node. And now what's happened is it's locked this node, so the node is no longer editable by default, and it's created a shared node. So now I can go through and on any other shot, I can say right-click, say add node, and then I have my shared node 1. By the way, you can rename these. You don't have to call it shared node 1. I can then add that node, and it's added that node with the exact same settings as this node, right? So we have two nodes in the tree, and you can do this anywhere in the tree with the same settings. Now I can go through and say unlock this node, and let's say I want to tweak this look. I want to make it more a little more kind of bleach bypassy. So I can go through and just say do the luminance and do my little bleach bypassy. So I did my bleach bypass look. This other shot now has that same adjustment made to it on that same node, right? So this is a great way to do tweaks to grades across a bunch of nodes. If you can do a single node show look, you can very quickly put your show look into the tree, and then be able to add effects after it, add nodes after it, or add nodes before it, independently of anything else. It's not affected by the sort of overall order of operations.
Hey Juan, there was a question about, is there any benefit to grouping cameras and doing a pre-group color space transform?
Yeah, that's a great use. So if you have like a dock that, let's say, has shot on 3 different cameras and you want to like modify them all to be on the same color space, yeah, you could totally go through and do a group, create a group for the individual cameras, add that pre-clip grade to do your color space transforming them all into one camera or another. I think if you're getting into that level of things, then we'll have another session at some point about color management. Then you can start to use like the built-in color management to do that rather than having to build it out individually in the node. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. One other thing I want to show you guys in terms of cool ways to apply grades across multiple clips is, and this is new in version 16, I think, is you have this adjustment clip functionality, which lets you can drag a clip. This is kind of like a adjustment clip in Premiere or any other applications. You can drag this clip across multiple clips, and you can see it didn't really do anything right off the bat. But if I go through into my color page, you can see now I have this adjustment clip visible right here. This is my adjustment clip. And what this does is it applies whatever effects I add into this node tree to all of the clips that are underneath it. So I'm going to do something weird just to show you in a very stylized way. I'm going to add like a heavy grain to this. So I'm just going to show the grain only, and I'm going to make it really big and really clunky and very sharp. Let's say that. So very ugly grain. I'm applying it. You can really see it. Everybody's seeing it on the image there. So now every clip that is underneath this adjustment layer has this really clunky, ugly 8mm style grain applied to it. And then the clips that are not under that adjustment layer do not have it applied to it. If I want to extend it out, I can extend it out this way, and I will apply it to those clips as well. Make sense?
Yeah, awesome.
So those are a few ways to, and then we already talked about the timeline grade, of course, but those are a few ways to sort of be able to apply effects, apply grades across a bunch of clips in one go.
What about lightbox?
So lightbox is, I think that lightbox is super handy for on-set. I really like it for working through features and working through long form content. What lightbox is just a view that lets you, I'm going to turn off my controls here. It's just a view that lets you see all of your timeline, all those thumbnails laid out. You can make the individual screen images as big or as small as you want. Well, not as big. You can only go so big, but you can adjust the sizing of the individual clips. You can see here that it gives you like a time code reference to where they are in the show. This is really useful for like super long form stuff. I will often, when I finish or I'm close to finishing up a feature film and I have it all in one sequence and I'm kind of doing like the review and tweak passes, I would just flip into this mode and kind of get a glance, at a glance view, like a bird's eye view of what's happening overall in terms of tonality, in terms of the consistency. So I can quickly kind of see the progression of things, see if I'm hitting the right notes at the right time. And I think this is really also great for like sessions with DPs, sessions with directors, where you can, if you turn on this little output enabler thing, it'll actually have this image on your SDI monitor. So you can actually show it on external monitor. I have a big 65-inch screen right behind me. I will often just throw this thing up on the 65-inch screen when we're talking about, oh, that one shot in that one place. And I'm like, which shot? I'll just throw up this view and then scroll through and they'll be like, shot 17, that's the one. So it's a really handy way to sort of be able to kind of quickly navigate through a bunch of shots at once.
Awesome. Sweet. I think the next thing we wanted to move on to was using power grades. Nate was going to cover this. This is something that people were asking a lot about.
I was actually going to give this one to Juan because.
All right, Juan, you're back up, bud.
Yeah, man. Sorry, you're on deck.
No, Nate, do power grades. Do power grades. Power grades. So this is my laptop. So this is not like my usual day-to-day computer. Power grades. The still library. I can't survey you guys, but just I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with still libraries. I'm assuming you use still libraries a lot on set, right?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. So I don't need to explain still libraries, but power grades are a kind of still library that transcends the project. So it's system-wide on your database. And so it's a great way to sort of save and use grades that you might use regularly or reuse regularly. It's a really good way to kind of get quick access to those grades. So on my power grades, I might have things like if I have a fixed node structure that I use for a project, so it's like I'm using the same set of nodes all the time, I will have that saved as a power grade and available to me. I have a power grade that lets me use, I've abstracted the sort of look elements of the array look, and I've turned it into like a set of nodes that I can apply to like any color space. So I have that saved as a power grade so I can quickly kind of show somebody, this is what it would look like in an array world. I have power grades for like a filmic look or like a nice bleach bypass power grade, or like any of these things that you might reuse regularly. I have a lot of like timeline nodes saved as my power grade. One cool thing is you can actually go into the, if you expand out, sorry, I'm just going to go back to power grade. If you expand out the gallery view, it'll actually bring up this gallery window, which used to be like its own page in Resolve, but they've changed that. And they have a bunch of sort of pre-built looks that you can apply. As I think you can tell from the preview, these are pretty aggressive looks, and so I wouldn't necessarily say that you should use this out of the box, but it's a good sort of starting point for like seeing how things are built out. So these are the looks that are built into the Resolve. These are not available to you in the page, but what you do to use them is you can drag them over either into your stills page, so I can save it as a still, or if there's ones that I use regularly, I might add it into my Power Grades page, so I can use it in Power Grades. And I close that, and now it's available in my Power Grades. And now I can say, just going to go through another shot here, and I can throw it on here. And so now I can look at that grade, apply it onto the shot. I can also, by the way, you can also preview this. I don't recommend using this feature. I hate it. But if you use live preview, you can hover over it, and it'll show you what that grade looks like on the shot that you're on. I don't recommend doing it. Don't do it. But if you want to apply the grade, you can do it that way. The nice thing about this, and the thing that's useful, is like you can start to kind of figure out how these grades are built. This is not a good example of that. Let me see if I can find a better one. So I'm going to, again,
Safari is pretty popular on set, though, I got to say.
The live preview?
No, night Safari look. That
Oh yeah,
all the
I
time.
imagine. Yeah. No, I mean, there's things that are like, for tobacco, for example, has this kind of glowiness to it, or Misty. Let's look at Misty. So you can see when you look at these, you can see kind of, don't show reference though, thank you. You can see how these grades are kind of built out. You see how this is adding mist? And so you can look and see, oh, what did they do to actually build that out? Oh, they used misting, and they used the mist feature, and they dialed in these values. Or a tobacco, has like this kind of windowy thing or whatever. There's one that's like bleach bypass that is a good way to sort of see how, let's see here, cross dye. Great, that's a good one. So cross dye, let's see how they built that. We apply it, we look at it, and we can see, okay, well, they use some curves, and they have this weird curve on the Y axis. And then let's see what else they did a hue sat adjustment, and they did. So you can see how these grades have been built out. And then based on that, you can go through and start developing ideas, start kind of coming up with new concepts. I think this is comparable, and the kind of strategy behind this is like comparable to sort of the magic bullet looks that you might get. So you have that kind of like easy access to like preset things that just give you a starting point for something else.
Yeah, I think
go ahead, Nate.
I was gonna say for use on set, Power Grades is like useful if there's like things that you use regularly, like a highlight recovery you could have as a Power Grade, or like a vignette with already like the amount of softening that you'd normally use. So you could just like quickly drag those onto whatever you're, just as like, tools, pre-made tools. So you don't have to keep making them over and over again.
Yeah, and one cool thing is, so if you have like, let's say the highlight recovery, and you want to add it somewhere in the chain of the grade that you're already doing. So let's say you have a grade built on something, and I want to add this Night Safari, which is hugely popular on set. I can, but I have a grade already on it that I don't want to like change that grade. This might be a better example here. So I don't want to change this grade. I want my magenta color cast, but I want to add Night Safari to it. I can just right click on it and say append node graph. And what this will do is it'll leave your existing grades and then add these nodes to it. So it's an easy way to sort of add to your already done work.
I was going to say, for our on-set purposes, one thing to be really careful with Power Grade, since it is a frame grab or still image from the actual footage, is that if you're working on like a Coke job one week and then a Pepsi job next week, and you have clients looking at this, just be careful that they can see the images and whatnot. You want to be careful about that kind of thing.
So what I do, and I got this from Mark Wybatch, is actually I will just take the generator and add my SMPTE color bars, and then I'll throw in some text. So I can add a little texty poo, and I can say, okay, this is what this thing is. So I'm going to say bleach bypass.
So you apply your Power Grade to that.
So I build this out, then I make it into a compound node like I showed you guys earlier. So I can right click on it and say create new compound node eventually. My machine's going to crash. Yeah, and there it is. And create All right, great. And now, so now I have a compound node. So now I can copy over that grade to this compound node. So I'm going to copy over this grade, let's say. So now I've got my grade applied to that. And I can say right click and say grab still. And now I can rename it whatever I want. So where's the rename? Change label. I'm going to call this bleach bypass. So no one's any the wiser where that came from. You should make the text bigger though.
Beautiful. That's a great workaround. All right. Any other questions about that? We plan to move on to node types with examples. This is something that we don't actually have a lot of time to get into on set, using all the different kind of node types. And without going too deep into it, Juan, do you want to show us?
I mean, I've been kind of hogging the mic here, so
or Nate.
Let's see. Or Jamie, did you want to go to this while we were on that, to go to the stills naming?
Oh yeah, show that real quick. That's really helpful.
That one I was pretty stoked on, just because I didn't know. Let's share my screen.
This will be helpful for everyone on set, but still namings, so you can reference things as well.
So here, let's do, I didn't put that in. Grab. Throw this on here. So it's just like a red shot. Normally when we're syncing sound, most of the sound mixers are adding shot and scene metadata for us, so it'll auto-populate. I'm just assuming that we would have done that. I'm just gonna do it manually right here, so we'll just do this 101. So if you're in your settings here, general options, this they added in 15, I think, automatically label grades, gallery stills using, and then you can do custom label using tags. And if you put in percent, yeah, you could do source clip name, and then you could also do, say, for example, the scene info. So
I believe that percent brings up all the metadata tags that are available to you.
Right. So you could just go through and search or scroll through. But that seemed to be the most useful, is that combination. If you save that, let's drop this on the timeline. Grab this still. And you'll see here that the still automatically is the name of the clip followed by 101. So you could swap those around, but that was always the one that I always had the manually labeling was always a pain in the ass. So that seemed to be a little bit of a time saver for myself, and I just found out about that recently. Don't know if that's old news, but I thought that was worth sharing.
Also, when you right click on it, show them the thing you have to enable.
Oh yeah, so use labels on still export, and then when you go ahead and export, then you have your name auto-populated right there. And then once you have that checked, use labels on stills export, then any other clip is gonna get that same labeling. I'd already labeled that one 101 as well. Yeah.
I do find it helpful to add, if you go back to the settings real quick, Nate.
Yep.
I do find it helpful to add the still number on export so that you can track timeline, version, and clip number, just if you had to reference that and go back at some point.
Gotcha.
So it'd be like 1.8.3 and you would know exactly which clip it was.
Right. Let's see. Curtis, let me see. I don't know.
Curtis said, is that a single export, not batch export? So Curtis, if you selected a whole bunch of stills in your gallery, this would apply to everything that you exported. It's awesome for commercial workflow.
So everything retains its name for batch export.
This feature took years of waiting.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's that.
Node types with examples.
Nodes.
Oh, real quick, Kevin had a question. Is there a way to, if you're on a 1080p timeline, but you're working with higher resolution footage, is there a way to get full res stills out of that timeline?
I don't think so unless you change your timeline resolution. Juan?
Sorry, what was the question?
I didn't think that was possible, but if you're working on an HD timeline, you get full resolution stills. So you'd have to change your timeline resolution, right?
You have to, you have to grab the still while the timeline is
in
whatever resolution you want. Yeah.
Major oversight. Resolve.
I mean, how often are you trying to export full res stills though? Like, is it advantageous?
The bummer is after you grab 5 days worth of stills and then they want full res stills.
Yeah. So one thing you can do is after the fact is you can actually right click on a still and say, go to the
Let's see.
No.
Yeah.
Match. Yeah. So it'll take you to that frame and then you can grab it again really quickly.
But you'd have to do that for tons of stills
manually
possibly.
Not great.
No.
A little bit of a time saver. Let's see. So we'll go back to the node types. Yeah. So
this would also lead us into chroma key. If you want to just start with that, we can combine two at the same time.
Gotcha. Well, Juan, you had that chroma key clip.
Yeah. I mean, do you want me to?
Yeah.
Do you want to? I guess I can drive if you want.
All right.
Sure.
I'm gonna stop.
And Nate, feel free to jump in because I think different people have different views of the utility of the nodes. There's actually not that many nodes that you would use on a regular basis in Resolve. The color corrector node, which is kind of the serial node, the standard node, has all of the capacity, pretty much all of the capacity that Resolve has in that one node, right? You can have any combination of color grades, any combination of like curves, any combination of blur and misting and defocus and whatever else, noise reduction, whatever effects you want, you can have in one node. So the times that you're using like the other nodes are relatively few. Just keep that in mind. That's why, these things don't come up day to day, they come up just occasionally. There's the serial node. Serial before is just adding a serial node before the current node. The add serial just adds a serial node after the current node. So that's the only difference there. Parallel and layer are the two kinds that you might use regularly, or the other kinds of nodes that you might use regularly. Layer, we've kind of talked about a little bit already, right? It's sort of sequentially stacked images. So it has the base image and then the image on top of that and then the image on top of that. So that means that, let me just quickly come up with the classic demonstration of this. I'm going to just do add layer and I'm going to add a layer. So in this node, I'm going to add a window and I'm just going to take this window and make it red. So you're not even seeing it because I'm layered, but if I highlight it, you can see I've made that node red, right? In this node, I'm going to add a window and I'm going to move it over here and I'm going to make it green. So you're still not seeing it because there's another layer on top of this, but in the node itself, that one's green. And in this one, I'm going to add another window and I'm going to make this window blue. And so now you can see all of those three things happening, right? But the pixels, I'm just going to switch over here. The pixels that are red are the pixels that are visible behind the pixels that are green. So when those pixels go green, it covers over the red. It doesn't combine with the red. It covers over the red. And then the blue covers over the red and the green. Everybody with me? A little thumbs up?
Yeah.
Great.
Awesome.
Okay, so that is the layer mixer. That means those pixels go through in terms of layers. They don't combine. They're just over one another. If you do things like, for example, reduce the key output, you basically just affect the amount of that layer, the visibility of that layer, but it doesn't change the way the layers combine. Okay? So then the other kind of layer is the parallel layer. And the parallel layer, like the name suggests, means that these operations happen in parallel. So the same pixels can have two operations happening on them. So watch what happens when I switch this layer mode from layer mixer to parallel mixer. You see how I can morph into parallel mode. This just changes that layer node into a parallel node. I'm going to morph into parallel node, and you see what happened right there? I'm just going to do it again just to show you. Morph into layer mode. The blue circle is pretty clear. The green circle is very clear. I'm just going to, you know what I'm going to do is very quickly just turn the softness down to 0 in all three so you can really see those pixels. So softness is 0. All right, so yeah. So the blue pixels are very, very clearly defined. Green pixels are very clearly defined. Red is very clearly defined. When I morph into layer mode, they start to overlap, right? The red and the blue form magenta. You get a magenta effect. The red and the green form a yellow effect. The blue and the green form a cyan effect. These operations are happening concurrently, not consecutively, right? So you now have a concurrent effect of these operations. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So that's the difference between layer mixer and parallel mixer. And then the only other one that you see on here is the add outside. And all this is doing is basically adding a node where it's already mapped the key to it. So it's already connected the key. You see how that key is connected? And I'm going to undo this. And I'm going to add just a regular node. I'm just going to move this over. I'm just going to add a regular node. The key is not connected. Add a outside node. The key is connected. That's the only difference. Okay, just a shortcut. Just a shortcut for doing basically this. That's all it is. Well, this and this. That's what it is. I think that was
Not so useful. Yeah, it's like that one. I almost never use outside node.
I use it a fair amount. I have it on a because it's not on the well, it is on the advanced panels, but it's not on the mini panels, which I use a lot. So on the mini panel, I have a Stream Deck with it combined. What I use it for regularly is like basically like vignettes, like where I'm trying to draw attention to something in a scene. So I might, for example, set up my vignette here, and so I might want to do a little. I'm just going to flip this around, do a little adjustment, bring down the edges there, and then add an outside node. And now I have only the non-vignetted stuff in that node. And so now I can go through and do even finer details. I can go through and do like my individual actors and maybe goose them up a little bit. So I take them and kind of up the saturation or up the midtone or whatever, right? So I can do that very quick building of shaping of a scene. Often you're trying to do one thing on the outside, another thing on the inside. So that's a pretty regular use for me.
Gotcha.
Not necessarily that useful on set. I don't know if it applies to that, but should we go on key?
Yeah, let's see key.
So I think what was the context of how this came up? I think somebody was asking about like doing green screen on set.
Yeah,
right?
every now and then we get asked on a green screen shoot to just like show us a quick key of what something might look like, and they might give us assets to play around with. So
in this case, I've got these two shots. They're kind of, I'm just going to copy over the color space transform grade over here, so I get sort of what it looks like. So I have two shots, and I have the same background for both shots, and I just want to make a sort of scratch reference composite of the two. There's a few ways to do this. I'm going to show you the easiest way because I think it's probably the most viable for on-set use. I'm going to add a serial node. So I'm adding a node, and I'm just going to use, we haven't really talked about keying that much, but there's 4 keyers inside of Resolve. 3 of them are basically the same keyer with different functions enabled. So there's the HSL keyer, the RGB keyer, I'm sorry, that's actually a different keyer, and the Lume keyer. And the Lume keyer is just the HSL keyer with only the luminance channel enabled. They're literally the same keyer. So if I, for example, do a key on here, and I'm just going to do a key, let's say I do a key here, and I then go to the HSL keyer, that key remains intact, and now these other functions are available to me. Totally irrelevant to this thing, because the keyer that we want to use for doing a green screen key is the 3D keyer. The 3D keyer is not always that great for like skins or other things. It's a volumetric keyer. It's really, really spectacular for doing quick green screen keys. So with the 3D keyer, what you want to do is like draw an area around the color that you want to replace or remove. So I'm just going to quickly do a kind of a selection of the green, and you can see I already have a pretty good key there. You have some noise in the matte there and there. So I can say clean the white a little bit to clean that up, and the black looks actually pretty good. You want to do as little of this as you need in order to get the key. You don't want any more than the bare minimum of like aggressiveness in the key, right? You want the softest, most delicate key you can get away with. And so now I'm just going to turn off the highlight mode, and now you can see I've got this key selected. It's selecting the green, not selecting the outside. I'm going to add a alpha output, and I'm going to map my alpha output to that. And now you can see I have a key. It's inverted from what I need, but I have the key for what I need. Nice. So I'm going to invert the key. Now I've got my composite done, and you can see that the problem here is there is a ton of spill and green that's coming into the hair that doesn't look very nice. That's not what you want, and this is the same thing any compositor would have to deal with. And there's a convenient fix for this, which is this little despill checkbox. If you turn, I'm just going to show you without the key here. So when I turn on that despill, you see the green disappears, and in the background here, that green becomes blue. It's basically just doing a hue replace on the green. And so the net result of this is a much nicer key that gets you in the ballpark of what you need to be. You may want to like blur the key a little bit. You may want to erode the key a little bit. No, I'm adjusting the wrong one. You want to do it here. You may want to blur the key a little bit. You may want to erode the key a little bit to get it like more inside. You can do all kinds of stuff with it. Again, the thing you want is the least possible amount of manipulation that gets you to the result you desire. So I want to do as little as possible to this image in order to get the key. And I can copy, I'm going to copy this key from here. I can apply it over here. And it does the same key. You know, on the close up here, for example, I can see already that I have more noise in the blacks than I would like. You can see there's a lot of noise there. I don't know if maybe you can't see it. So I might want to clean the blacks a little bit, do stuff like that. And then again, I'm going to add the alpha output, map my alpha output in there, and voila, I have my key. So if you're doing like a really, you know, high-end composite, you're trying to do a VFX shot, this might not be a good enough keyer. But I think for like a talking head kind of thing, this is a plenty good keyer. And it's certainly good enough to like preview on set.
Would you mind showing again how you got the background there? Is it just on the timeline? That's
yeah, it's on the timeline. So the background was already on the timeline.
Got it.
And so, by the way, this means that whatever if you want to change the background, you want to throw another shot in there. We can do. Let's throw some color bars behind it. You can change that background just by dragging another image underneath it. Is that a good enough key? I mean, from my eye,
for on set, yeah, it's great. Yeah.
How about masking a tight shot?
What's that?
Can we mask the tight shot and fill the frame with the city?
Oh, the wide shot. Yeah, so you can select the shot, and you can say crop. So if we use the cropping tool, we can crop left and right. So you can actually that's not going to work. Why not? Is it this? No, it's not that. Why won't that work? We can do that. If you have like garbage, like a garbage mat on the screen, I don't have one here. Oh, I have one here. So this is blown up. Let me remove the scaling. Input scaling, edit sizing. There we go. So I'm going to reset the zoom. It's not resetting. Okay. That's weird. Okay, let's say I have this scenario where I have turned off cropping. I have some extra crap on the side, right? So I need a garbage mask. I can actually really easily do that. So I can go through, select that same the same keyer node. So I've got my key over here. It's including this stuff. I want to exclude this stuff. All I need to do is draw a garbage mask with my masking tool and invert that. And now I have a garbage mask. So I've gotten rid of that object on the side. Is that what you meant?
Completely.
Yeah.
The cropping, the edit cropping is a little funky. So when you do the edit cropping, it, you know, Resolve this is kind of a hack, right? We're hacking this in the color page and the alpha. So it's not like an NLE where like everything's happening on the timeline. Some things are happening in a different part of the order of operations. So the cropping happens at a different part. So if you do a crop, you'll get black on the left and right side. So if you do a crop in the edit page, you'll get that black. So you don't want to do that. You want to do the masking in the color page.
Awesome. Any other questions about like green screen and key?
Or green ski?
Green ski.
I know that guy.
Well, we did have on there like color trace / remote grades. Did you want to touch on that? No. I think we need to set something up for that.
Color trace, yeah, color trace is useful. I think we haven't even touched on like Conform yet, but it's really useful for like editorial if you have a change in the edit and you need to update it and move color grades from one to the other. I usually end up doing it manually anyway.
I think we can move on to Conforming if you want. And maybe we can touch on that, Ben.
Yeah, I think Nate can start on that. The only other thing I would add is just on the remote grading is it's a clusterfuck. So yeah, it just breaks all the time. I find it really unreliable. So like if once in a while it works and it's a kind of a fluke, the way remote grading works is it basically just sends commands from one station to another. So you're only sending like essentially what you're doing with your mouse and what you're doing with your keyboard, right? That's all it's sending. It doesn't understand anything about what the image is. It doesn't understand anything about your timeline or your computer's performance. So you basically link up two machines with Resolve color grading, and then you send data about your manipulations that you're making from one machine to another. So you have to have the identical timeline on both machines. The performance of the machine of the timeline is dependent on the performance of the machine on each end. And then the connection breaks regularly. So I just, when we do remote grading, which we're doing a lot of lately, and we've done a lot of for a while, we just stream an image. Like that's just a lot more reliable. It's, you know, I'm not depending on their machine performing well. I'm not depending on them seeing my manipulations. Sometimes there's a delay. We have like maybe a 2 or 2 second latency. So using Streambox. So we just use Streambox and just stream it out that way.
Would it be useful for us on set, say like if we want to use like a lower power machine on the same network as like our render machine?
No.
And you wanted to drive the say render machine like
headless? No, that's a different thing. So you can there's remote rendering. That's on the edit page, and that requires like shared storage where both machines can read the same storage structure. And we use that all the time. Like we use that in my shop. I have like 5 machines feeding my shop, and they're all pretty robust. But if sometimes I want to render on one machine when I'm working on another machine, so I'll just remote render that stuff. Like for example, if I need to make ProRes files and I'm on a Windows PC, I can't make ProRes from Windows PC, but I can send the render to a Mac and it'll make it there.
Nice. All right, I think we're gonna switch over to Conforming, which is actually like the last thing we had on our agenda. And some of you guys you dabble in some final color, and Nate has a really great project set up to explain the process.
Cool. So on here. So let's see, I just only have the folder structure set up right here. So what I'm gonna do on the edit page, I'm going to import an XML that I have. This is from like a commercial that I graded. So the editor sent me a reference video and an XML. Let's see. So yeah, we're gonna automatically set project settings, automatically import source clips in the media pool. I'm gonna ignore file extensions when matching because I'm trying to get it to match to the R3Ds rather than the ProRes that they sent me or that they edited with. Hit OK, and then we'll point it to where our footage is. And there we go. So let's see, 13 of 45 clips were not yet found. you want to select another folder search? Let's do no for now. Then we'll get a list here of things that went wrong. So there's some graphics missing. And then I've got some timecode stuff with some DJI footage. This is like pretty normal errors to see when you're conforming, especially when you're doing like DJI or like any sort of not completely professional camera. Let's see. Oh, there's music missing as well. So that built my timeline pretty quick. We have some gaps here. The other thing that we always ask for is a reference video. So they've given me, so pause, conform. Short. So you can right click, add as an offline reference clip. Go back to the edit page, right click on your timeline. Timelines, link offline reference clip. Now here in your preview window, you can pull up your offline, and now you have your offline versus what's conforming. So some helpful view modes that you have is if you right click on your program view, mix wipe, vertical, let's see, so you see here, vertical, horizontal, you can see what you're missing. And then difference is what I use probably the most. And this is good for seeing if timing is different, like if it looks close, but you can actually see like if it's a frame off, because you'll see it split if you're in difference mode.
Just so people know, in difference mode, if it's black, everything is perfectly lined up. If you see something in difference mode, there could be a sizing difference, there could be a frame offset, like that. When you see something, that means it's not lining up perfectly.
Right. And so you'll still see some stuff right here just because it's the difference of the color between the two. Let's see, we'll get here. We have DJI 141. So for whatever reason, that straight up didn't pull anything in for that shot. The time code was far enough off. So for this example, is just kind of a brute force conform.
Hey, Nate, can I
Yeah.
drive for a second?
Yeah.
So one thing you can do, this is your timeline here, right?
Yep.
So you can right click on timeline and go timelines, reconform from media storage. And this will let you actually do like a more aggressive search on a piece of media, meaning a piece of drive. So you can actually say match just by time code. So any clip that's in the directory we're going to tell it to look, that has the time code that matches the clip we're looking for, it would link to. But you can also say, fuck time code. I only want you to worry about the file name, and you can even use a loose file name. So if the extension is different, totally fine. Use a loose file name. And then you can, so now it's only going to look at the file name. So it's only going to look at these DJI clips. Actually, if you want, you can even select the clips. So you can say individually select this clip, where that clip selected, go right click on here, go timeline, conform from media storage, and you can say only selected clip.
Perfect.
And now where would this be on your structure?
So go to 16 terabyte backup RAID, AMA color clips.
This here.
Yeah, zip pause.
Okay, but we don't even need to go further than that. As long as there's no other file named DJI, whatever,
Yeah,
it's not going to find it. So I hit OK, and then it's going to look through that file structure. And there, found the clip. And you can see it linked up to something, but obviously it's added in the media pool, but obviously the time code is so fucked up that it can't actually link to it, but at least you have it in the media pool now. So you could do the same thing for any other DJI clips that are in the sequence and get them all in at once rather than having to go through and manually find the shots.
Would you then have to iMatch it at that point, Juan?
Yeah, so I think that's what Nate was going to get to right now.
Oh, sorry.
So I'm going to release the controls if I can. Can I? Yeah, there it is. It's all yours.
There you go. So let's see here. Get offline. See what the shot is. So we can see.
I think.
Oh, you know, yeah.
I think you
So
need
I
to
think,
like scrub through the beginning of the shot. You might have to zoom out and sort of do it faster. There you go. And if you hold down Shift, I think it does it even faster. But an easier way might be just to, if you double click on the clip, and then you can just say, find the frame and just say force conform, or just replace it.
yeah. So we'll just right click, force conform with clip in the media pool.
What the find in the media storage saves you is having to go through and find the shot, not the brute force that you have to undertake to actually match it.
Right. So yeah, so we got the shot here. We can go mix swipe and we can see that it's off. So these are like some previously trimmed clips from.
It's not the full original.
Yeah.
So you can just put it in the middle, or?
Yeah, there we go. So difference, there we go. So that's a easy way when you're having to eye match. Difference mode is probably the best way to see like where you're off.
Easy.
Yeah, exactly. When you get to force conforming stuff.
So Nate, I don't know if with the DJI stuff, sometimes what happens is like the NLE will actually do like the frame count instead of time code, and so if that's the case, what you can usually do is go right click in the clip and say ignore time code and actually replace the time code with like a frame count. So that might actually, well, it's hard to tell if that's the case by the visual or not, but
I know,
right?
Yeah. Let's see here. Next question. Cool.
Can I drive again for a second just to see something?
Yeah. Hey, there's a question to both of you guys. Is there anything that you would talk to the editor about before they send you the files? I mean, obviously there's some prep work that should go into this, right?
Yeah, I can. Once we get through with this, I can show you. We have a prep sheet that we send out to editors to prep things. That helps us avoid a lot of these issues. So one cool thing is the edit index is super handy for Conform. You have this like edit index that's available inside of Resolve, and this is basically like an EDL of representation of your timeline. But one thing it lets you do is you can right click on it and say show offline clips, and it will only show you the offline clips in the. Oh, hang on a second. Show offline clips. Yeah, that's what I want. Let me see here. Why did it show me something?
I think there's
else?
just a lot of offline clips.
Yeah, but it should only be showing me offline clips, not just the DJI stuff. All right. Well, in this case, let's do it a different way. I'm just gonna say show all, and I'm gonna search through these, and I'm gonna search for files that start with DJI. And so, great, that gives me all my DJI clips. I know this first one is good, but these are screwed up. And actually, you can see, by the way, that the source time code is looking like it might be a 0 count situation because it is kind of very early on. But because you've trimmed the clips, they're not going to have the same runtime anymore. This is one of the reasons why you want to avoid trimming clips if the clips don't have proper time code, because then the sort of 0 count time code doesn't work correctly. But anyway, I can select all these clips and I can say right click, or is it click here? No, what was it? I'm trying to think of, like, there's a way to basically select all of those clips in the sequence, but it's not letting me do it. So you can quickly go through and now that you've got these sort of, oops. It's not letting me zoom in for some reason. Oh, there it goes. Okay, now that you've got these sort of selected, you can go through and actually, is there a way to disable that edit? Yes, I want the selection tool. Here we go. Now that I've got these selected, I can go through and I selected this, and now I'm gonna just shift select, yeah. And now I can go to the next one, select this one, select this one, this one, this one. So I can very quickly select all the missing clips. Select this one. Select this one. Oops, it's actually selecting across multiple clips. Let's just do this. I'm just going to select the range here. And this, oh. Why isn't it letting me? I think the behavior here is a little funky because I'm remoting.
Right.
There we go. Okay. Oops. There. Let's just say these are, just for the sake of this, these are all the clips I want to select because it's just not cooperating right now. So I've selected those offline clips. I can go through, right click on here, do my conform, reconform from media storage. Do the same thing, just want to match the file name. Hit OK. And boom, it imported all those clips. It didn't necessarily link correctly to those clips, but they're there. And they're correctly associated with the right clip number. So I can go through and find the clip. Oh, Zoom is not working at all. I can go through, find the clip, and then right click on it. And let's say this is 29. So I can select 29, say conform lock with media pool clip. And now it's got the right clip. I do difference mode. And now you can very quickly, I think it's going to be around the middle. So if I turn on slip here, and now I can just kind of eyeball it towards the middle because you've trimmed them. They're always going to be kind of, the middle frame is always, the middle of the clip is going to be where it lines up because you've trimmed them to that. They're going to have handles of like 2 seconds or whatever it is, right? So the individual clips here, let's try this one. So this is 148. I'm going to right click over here, 148, say conform, reveal, oh, sorry, not reveal media storage. Shift 4. 148, all right, I got to click on the clip here. Conform lock with media pool. And then I think it's 2 seconds. So then I can just go skip back.
Yeah, and this one I think is probably mirrored too.
2 seconds. You can also, so it's exactly 2 seconds is the, oh, this one's flipped, but you can see that it's exactly 2 seconds in terms of the time. So I could then switch into slip mode and say minus 2 seconds and get it to the right frame every time. So there are ways to make this a lot easier. Although this one's maybe slightly off. Yeah, this one's not 2 seconds, but it's definitely in the ballpark. If you want, I can quickly walk through our prep sheet, and that might give you guys some ideas about how to prep these things.
Yeah, let's take a look at it.
Nate, if you can ditch me. Oh, let's see. So are you guys seeing the color space prep sheet?
Yep.
Okay, so this varies by NLE. We have prep sheets for Avid. We have prep sheets for Premiere. We don't get a ton of stuff from Final Cut Pro X. We don't get a ton of stuff from other things. So those are the 2 NLEs we get most of our material from. We have basically what we need from editorial is, you know, an XML, a reference movie, and the assets, the original camera assets, which I'm sure you guys are really familiar with. We ask people to clean up their timelines because some editors are great and always clean up their timelines. Some people are just garbage people and they just leave a trashy timeline, which makes it really difficult for us because it just means a lot more clips that we have to conform and a lot more media we have to manage, and then we have to clean up the timeline, and it becomes a big problem for us in terms of making sure we get all the right clips. Basically, we ask them to remove anything that isn't visible, that isn't important to the timeline, to the sequence. We even ask them to remove audio. So we'll get into that in a little bit, but even the audio should be cleaned up. So essentially what you want to end up with is a timeline that looks kind of like this. You know, it's going from this kind of messiness to like just the video that's visible, and that's it. If you have like shots that are superimposed, like a split screen, or you're combining shots, then you want to stack those. But other than that, we don't ask for any stacking. When we deal with documentaries, we ask people to use the tracks to sort of organize things. So if they have camera original footage versus archival footage that might need to be treated separately, we'll ask them to use tracks to sort of organize that stuff. These effects, which we ask people to just leave in because we want them in the reference movie. they don't translate ever. And so if we're having to rebuild, like feature films, we'll usually do the mastering on our end. Commercials, we don't usually do the mastering. We'll round trip things back out. But like feature films, documentaries, we actually end up doing the mastering at our end. We ask for delivery of those graphic assets as ProRes 444 with an alpha channel or similar. Sometimes we build them ourselves, so we're actually creating the effects. Excuse me, my voice is disappearing now. I'm hoping it's just because I'm talking so much, not because I have coronavirus. I'm dying, guys. So, we ask people that the other thing to point out is like certain effects don't translate. So these are different for Avid than for Premiere, but keyframe effects don't really translate very well, like repos, they don't translate. Warp stabilizers don't translate. Speed changes don't translate necessarily, like some formats of it they'll do, or any kind of video filter stuff. So we ask them to do a shot list of those clips that have those things, just so we know where they are and we can go through and recreate them where we need to. Multicam clips have to be flattened. They never work. Multicams are a disaster for onlining. So that's really important to go through and flatten the multicam clips. Same thing in Avid. If you guys want, if you're interested, we can go through the same things in Avid if you'd like, but it's really the same procedures, just different buttons. So then the other thing we ask is for them to burn in time code with clip names. Now, this is something relatively new. This wasn't the case so much like 5-10 years ago where these filters weren't necessarily available, but nowadays they're standard pretty much in all the NLEs, including in Resolve. You can do this. So we ask people to actually burn in not just the time code for the sequence, which we don't really care about because that just burned into the file, but we ask for the time code for the clips themselves and the clip names. And so this, if we run into the kind of conform problems that Nate, you had as your example, we would be able to very quickly in the reference movie see what the time code, the intended time code of the source was, and we would also be able to very quickly see the clip name of the source was. Sometimes when you use really aggressive conform techniques, you end up with conforms to shots. Like for example, in stills, you might have like 5 shots that match the time code, or 10 shots or 100 shots that match the time code, but they don't necessarily match the clip name. And so when we use really aggressive conform techniques, like conforming only by time code, we want to have that clip name available so we can quickly differentiate whether it's the right clip or not. So we asked them to put it in a transparent video track and then add these effects to that video track. So you add like the clip name generator effect and the time code generator effect. And so what you end up with is these burned in images. If you have multiple layers of tracks, you need to have multiple instances of the effects, but you end up with like what the source file name is and also what the time code is for that source file. And so this makes it really easy for us to then link that reference movie like Nate, you showed, but also be able to like figure out edit issues or conform issues very, very quickly based on the reference movie. And then we have them pull away all the audio from the sequence, and we have them delete those graphics and basically just give us an XML that is those 2 tracks or 3 tracks or however many tracks. But we just want the picture. We don't want to have to link up a bunch of audio stuff. We just want picture in the XML, but we do want that audio in the reference movie because we want to hear contextually what's going on in the movie. But we don't want to have to link up all that stuff. So we just want just the video elements in the XML, kind of like how you showed, Nate. We want to have just that stuff strung out. And then we have them make a Final Cut Pro X7, Final Cut Pro 7 XML, and we have them make this reference movie and then deliver that stuff to us. And we go through the conform just like you showed, Nate. And we also see these exact same issues. DJI stuff, ends up a mess. Anything MP4 that doesn't have time code in the file will end up being a conform mess usually. So we ask people to give us the original camera footage, not consolidated, not conformed, unless we've talked to them and figured out, okay, the consolidated version is the best way to do it. We're doing a lot more consolidated now that people are having to transfer stuff online in order to deliver it to us.
Yeah. Long plays with EDLs and whatnot.
Yeah, exactly. Oh no, not long play with EDLs. No, we just have them do like I try to avoid that like the plague. But
I've been doing that a lot recently though, actually. With some,
it's a sledgehammer technique, right? So we've done it. We did a bunch of beauty spots for a cosmetic company that they just wanted like touching up on skins and that kind of stuff, but they had already done the edits and these were kind of like demo videos. And so for that one, we had them like do the long play and just split it up because it was like 4 shots and it wasn't really making a difference. It was full res. But I dislike doing that because it burns in resizing. If there's, as often there is in documentaries particularly, there's a ton of mixed frame rates, and how you conform those mixed frame rates, how you prepare that footage, makes a big difference to the final outcome. So we really want to be able to get the original frame size, the original frame rate. We want it to be as raw and original source as possible, so that whatever we need to do to fix that image, we can do it expediently. There are times where you want to do that conform. Yeah.
Sorry,
it's called
sorry
a pre-conform, by the way.
Do you ever run into an issue where you send out this prep sheet and then you get files that are nowhere close to what you want, and then you just keep sending it back? Like, is there a point where you just won't touch the project if they're not obeying what you guys need?
No, we work with clients. So no, most editors. So we're lucky in that and I'm sure you guys you're dealing with like productions that hire DITs, so they have some budget. They're hiring competent people usually. So most editors know to do this stuff. The one thing that is kind of new is that reference movie with the burned in source time code and source names. That is the sort of red flag that somebody didn't read the prep sheet, because if that comes in and it doesn't have those things, then we know they didn't read the prep sheet. But the other stuff is pretty standard. What happens a lot is I get XMLs that have they'll have removed the audio, but they don't delete the extra tracks, and so I end up with like this XML that has like 80 tracks, but it has nothing in the tracks. And so then that's another flag that's like a little pet peeve of mine, where I'm like, because it's one click. Like you just right click and go delete empty tracks and you get rid of all those. They didn't do it. I get mad. I don't know if there's a quick way to sort of get a sense of a read of the room if people want to see the same thing, but for Avid. I don't know how useful that is, but it's pretty much the same stuff, just different buttons.
Oh, don't forget you're over your time frame, so that's however long you're good to go. We'll take you.
All right. Well, I mean, if there's any questions, then I'll answer those, and then we'll wrap it up, I guess.
Yeah, let's open up. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask her. Digitally raise your hand, and we can queue you up. Did you want to talk about, from a colorist point of view, like do's and don'ts or requests towards DITs, like don't ride the iris during shots? I've always heard that, but like anything that we can do to make your life easier and vice versa?
So one thing I think I see in the references that aren't necessarily great to do on set is like windowing. So I mean, I would encourage avoiding windowing in any way, just because I think as a professional colorist who spends a lot of time coloring, you would be surprised how few windows I use outside of like commercial work, right? Like I rarely actually do any windowing or tracking a shot. I'm usually working overall. And then if the lighting is fucked up, like something's too hot or too dark or whatever, that's when I'll throw in a window. But for the most part, DPs are pretty good about like, lighting things the way they like it. And so more often than not, the windowing is not adding so much as it's like taking away and adding complexity to something that isn't necessarily that complex. So I personally would say avoid windows as much as possible, unless they specifically call out for it. I mean, I've worked with DPs that like on set, they're like, they could throw up a flag and it's going to take 20 minutes, or they can just put a window on it in the post, and they're like, we'll just put a window on our post, and that's totally cool. And it's also great to get notes about those things, like, oh, make sure you couldn't throw up a flag on the wall, make sure you bring down the wall, or needs eye line or whatever. Those things are great to get in the notes as well.
Awesome. Kyle was asking if you have a favorite highlight recovery technique.
If I have a favorite highlight recovery technique, Nate,
yeah, Nate.
You probably have a highlight recovery technique.
Yeah, I mean, so mine is usually before the LUT is doing a Luma key and using the highlight recovery. Like that tool is pretty great. It gets pretty aggressive if you don't have it keyed. It quickly moves into like the upper midtones. But compressing that way is what usually my go-to in a window if need be.
I think I can share my screen here. I'll kind of quickly touch on something. So it's not a favorite recovery technique, but it's a recovery technique that I use in kind of extreme scenarios. And I think I kind of touched on this idea before. Well, two things. One, for quick and easy highlight recovery, like the just that the built-in, I think you saw me do this before, but the built-in highlight tool in here is actually pretty good. Like it does a pretty nice job of like bringing down the highlights and not affecting the rest of the image so much. This is clipped, like that's gone, but you get the idea here. Let me see if I can find a clip shot that isn't quite so clipped. Yeah. So highlight recovery works pretty well there. When I'm doing like sky replacement kind of stuff, and I'm really going heavy with the recovery, what I will do is actually use that. I'll use that color space transform node, and then set this to. This is going to be S gamma 3, and this is going to be S log 3, and this is going to be. I'm going to set the output color space is going to be S gamma 3, and the output gamma, I'm going to make it linear. And then I'm going to add another node, put that color space transform, set the input gamma to linear. And this is going to be S gamma 3, and then the output to S gamma 3 and S log 3. Okay, so what this is doing is, in this node, it's linearizing the image. And by the way, there's a difference between linear and video gamma. So video gamma, display gamma is like gamma 2.2, gamma 2.4. Linear is actually straight up linear, like scene referred. So in between these two nodes, what I essentially have is a scene referred linear image. That's what scene referred linear looks like in this case. So you can see here that if you look on the waveform, half my bit values are the first stop of highlights, and then the next half of the half is the next stop, and then on down and down. So this is actually a linear image. Now the advantage here is that I can do things like, I'm going to turn the loom mix down, and I'm just going to look at the final result here, which is this thing. And I want to bring down the highlights. I can just bring the gain down, and this works just like an actual exposure adjustment, right? So I can bring the gains down, and then I can exclude the bottom. So I want to exclude those bottom stops, and then do it that way. And now, obviously, you need to soften this up a bit, and maybe like not do quite so much. A little softer there, a little softer here, and maybe not quite so much. So anyway, this is really similar in result to the highlight tool, but a little more finessed. If I'm doing a replacement, like if I'm actually replacing the sky, as I often have to do with like exterior shots where the sky is blown out and we're actually trying to add blue and clouds in there, what I'll do this, but I will linearize the sky image as well, and then I will combine the two in linear space like this. Is that it?
Chris Bolton had a question. Chris, go ahead.
I have a primary question and then a little follow-up question. The primary question is more for when you're conforming and doing your online, when you've finished all your grading and you're exporting the clips. The one issue I quite often have is when, you know, the editor quite often wants to do slight touch-ups with the online footage back in their editor in a larger, you know, facility when they're doing their final tweaks and pulling everything together. One issue though is if you have a timeline where you have the same clip that's used in multiple locations on the timeline and it has offset time code, when you do the export, of course, you can't just export that as the original clip name because it will overwrite itself. Is there sort of a way to export it where you don't have that problem while still maintaining the clip names, or do you have to generate your own XML output so they're now referring to a new timeline?
So if you're doing a round trip workflow where you're actually rendering out like the edit material rather than a final single file, then you can do updates and just re-render those specific clips, and it'll just have the same file name, and so they can just replace those and use the same XML. If you're doing a single clip and then you're trying to do patches, then you just have to manually go through and just you can have it like render it out with in the delivery page. You can render it out. So I'm going to say, let's say I want to render individual clips. I can say, use source name, and then I can say use unique file names, and I can do a suffix instead of a prefix. So then that way, at least the beginning of the file name is the same, and there will be like a suffix that sort of defines how far into the sequence it is. I don't get that request a lot, so it hasn't been a real issue. Sometimes I get requests for patches where it's like, this one scene, can we bring it down? So I just do a patch for that one scene.
Right, right. And my follow-up is more to do with the beginning of a shoot. Is I quite often work with DPs that have a colorist they always work, finishing colorist they always work with, and we'll shoot content. They'll send the content down to the finishing colorist. The finishing colorist will actually create the LUT that we're using on set. And some colorists have sort of like the idea of with particular camera, they want to push they want to basically force you to underexpose the camera by a half a stop or a stop.
Overexpose.
What's your position on that?
You mean overexpose?
Well, the LUT would have basically overexpose the image, so you'd force to underexpose it, so you would preserve the highlights. As an example,
I usually go the other way. So I want people to overexpose the image. In digital sensors, the biggest issue is noise in the blacks. Most of the like high-end digital cameras have a ton of dynamic range, far more than you would need in most scenarios, particularly in controlled lighting scenarios. So even if you're shooting outdoors, you have a bounce board, you can get more light into you can get more fill light on the scene. It's hard to get those shadows filled in if you expose for the highlights in those scenarios. So it's better to get more light. So I would rather they overexpose. On like, also because like camera manufacturers tend to kind of like inflate their ratings. So, like Sony's like, you can rate this as 1600, and in reality, you look at the 1600. Well, actually now with the dual ISO, it's pretty good, but it used to be you looked at the 1600 and you're like, oh, this is actually really noisy, and it works better at 800 or 1250. And so I tend to suggest kind of overexposing by a half stop. So if you expose for whatever the native ISO is minus a half stop, you end up with a cleaner image, I think.
All right, I think we're kind of coming towards the end here. If anyone has any more questions. Oh, Dave Satin has a question.
And so after hearing what you just said there, Juan, and then I'll say, and then you're doing HDR, and then what?
Meaning? Oh, meaning what do you do when you do HDR? Dave?
I guess what I'm saying is like, I do nothing but HDR, and like what you just said is a really quick way to fail miserably. So I'm just curious.
I mean, there's so the shot you're looking at, I think you guys are seeing it now, would be a bad example, right? Like, so this is clipped in the highlights.
For sure.
Yeah, but this was a low budget production. This was not a high quality production. I think in most sort of fixed shooting scenarios, you're putting a lot more light on the actors in this kind of case, so that background isn't blown out. So the difference between the background and the foreground would be a lot more even. I think in most scenarios, outside of like uncontrolled daylight lighting, in which case you should expose for skins anyway, right? You should expose for the skins to look to read correctly. Absolutely. But outside of those scenarios where you're dealing with like intermittent clouds and sort of mixed daylight or uncontrolled lighting environments, when you're in a controlled lighting environment, I think the way to do it is if you want even like a dark and moody kind of show, you shoot a little hot. You'll still have headroom for your highlights in that controlled lighting environment, because your highlights should not be 16 stops above your shadows anyway. There's a very rare that you have that kind of scenario outside of like some crazy lighting effect, right? If you're shooting like a crazy nightclub scene, you probably want to throw more fill light anyways, right? And just have like these bright highlight things that kind of pop in and out. And in that case, you might want to kind of watch the highlights a little bit. But for like, let's say a dramatic dialogue scene, you're with some contrast and maybe a window in the background that's maybe a prop window, so it's not a real window, or these kinds of scenarios. I think you have enough headroom to sort of go a little hot, go half stop over on skins, so you have more detail and more of those bits allocated to skins and more of those read in the shadows, and you probably have a little headroom that you can afford to lose in the highlights. On controlled lighting, yeah, absolutely expose for skins, and then you just have to live with whatever you can get in terms of how it's going to look in HDR. But the other thing is, I think that people have this very linear, maybe it's the wrong word, but like this very realistic view of how HDR should look. And in reality, what we actually end up doing in terms of finishing is often softening those highlights and making those highlights a little more diffuse than they would be. So like, even though you can do, 2000 nits in HDR, we don't generally go that
That doesn't
high.
mean you should.
Right,
Just because
exactly.
you can doesn't mean you should.
Yes, and stylistically, often like a soft highlight roll-off is better looking. Particularly early on when we were first doing HDR, people were really kind of like trying to maximize the effect of HDR and like make it look, poppy and impactful. And in reality, in terms of like narrative, that often takes away from the actual like, flow of the show. If you're doing a good grade, like if I do my job really, really well, you're not thinking about the grade I'm doing, right? Like if a DP does the job really well, you're not thinking about how he lit it. If an editor does the job really well, you're not thinking about the way it's cut. That stuff sort of melts away if you're doing your job really well, and it becomes kind of, you fall into the story and you fall into the flow. I think with HDR, more often than not, the thing you want to do is just make it look smooth and elegant and graceful and embrace the sort of style of it, rather than try to have every little highlight have a big specular, distracting highlight. The first thing you look at is the brightest thing in the image. So, if you want people to focus on the action, you not necessarily want like poppy, bright highlights in the shot.
Hey, Isaac Guy had a question. Isaac, go ahead.
Hey guys, thank you so much for the session today. One question, just I'm kind of thinking about it from a set perspective. We like when we export a LUT or like a look, for instance, and we pass it on down the line, it won't have masking associated with it. So what tools like the qualifier, stuff like this, is there anything that, say we export that LUT or that look from that shot, does that not make its way to you, Juan? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So DRX is well, I should say that like we don't always get stuff from on set, so that doesn't always make its way to us. It's kind of a mixed bag. When it does make its way to us, like I find it useful as a reference, but I'm usually like starting again from scratch because I want to build it out maybe in a more detailed way, or I'm trying to kind of make it flow better. That's often what we're trying to like accomplish, is more of it, the stuff you might do on set to make a shot look good is not necessarily the stuff that's going to make the shot look good or look fluid in the context of the scene, right? So the DP are like, oh, I want to do this thing or that thing, but in the context of the scene, that actually becomes distracting sometimes. The stuff that, in terms of what you're asking, in terms of like what controls actually get down, carry through in the LUT, that you can actually do qualifiers. You just can't do blurs. You can't do that kind of anything that affects geometry. So if you're just modifying the specific pixel that you've qualified, then it's fine. You can even do like feathering in the qualification. You just can't do blurs. You can't do windows. You can't do shapes, right? Nothing geometric translates into a LUT. But a lot of stuff does translate into a LUT, and so that stuff does make it through. Most often, if there's things like qualifiers or those kinds of effects, I would usually rather know what it is. So I'd rather get the DRX so I can look at the DRX and see what the actual node tree was. And I wish
that's becoming more and more useful, by the way. I'm seeing colorists ask for DRX files so that they can reverse engineer what we did on set, so we can kind of go crazy with whatever.
Yeah, sometimes it's not even necessarily reverse engineer, but for example, if I'm as I often get asked to like match a grade or match a shot. So like sometimes we have pickup shots or something, or they're trying to match a look that was developed somewhere else. And so the way you approach that match would be greatly informed by knowing what the process was that the original artist did, right? So if I know that you use Windows to do certain things, I might not do the exact same thing, but at least it informs me that, oh, this red sweater is probably that level of red because there's a window on it and it's been keyed. And so it's different than the way that the red is being handled in the rest of the frame.
Gotcha. And just following that up, is there, from your experience and who you've worked with, is there any sort of like attachment or like something that is passed down the line, like whether it be Word doc, etc., like form of communication, email, anything that has helped out in that process?
I think it has more to do with production, right? Like, so if the production is managing the data well, then I'll get a drive from on set that has all the stuff that DIT put on it. And then that stuff becomes really informative and really useful, particularly as I'm trying to like troubleshoot. that doesn't always make it all the way down the line. I would say probably more than half of the time, whatever's done by the DIT in terms of media organization gets scrapped by the time I get it, so that the editor has actually gone through and organized it. So they don't always pass that stuff through. So, I mean, I think the DP is a good point for that kind of communication. I think if you guys pass along stuff to the DP, more often than not, the DP will pass that along to me when I'm working with the DP, which isn't always the case, but it's often the case. And so that stuff actually does make its way down to me from the DP. Editorial is actually less likely to pass that stuff down the line.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Any other
Awesome.
questions?
Yeah, anything else, guys? Well, we're gonna have to do another one of these.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to do one just on color management. That's a whole thing in itself.
It certainly is. That's like an 8-hour class, I think.
Yeah, if you're lucky. I taught a master's class on color grading last year, and probably spent, I mean, we probably spent, what is it, 45, 50 hours in class, and probably 30 of those were spent on color management. And I still didn't do it all.
All right. Well, we know you had to be done 40 minutes ago, so we don't want to eat up too much
so
of
I'm
your
gonna
time.
get going. Yeah.
Yeah, if anybody has any more questions, we can leave Nate on or myself, or we can end this.
I'm gonna take off, guys. Unless there's any last questions here.
Thank you for your time, man. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Awesome.
All right. Thanks, Dave. Good to see you.
You too, brother.
Just so everyone knows, this is going to be on the DIT-WIT YouTube as well. So make sure you check for it there.
It's been fun, guys. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, man.
All right, have a good one. Nate, thank you.
Thanks, Juan.
Bye, guys.
Later.
All right. I think my kids are up from a nap too.
All right, I'm going to close this. Later. Thank you so much, man.